Okay. If we start the echo, I think I know what to do. Then I'm going to start recording.
Yep, sounds good so far.
Okay. And Chair, I think anytime you're ready, we do have a quorum.
Great. Thank you. So this
Okay.
is Michael Chang, Vice Chair. Oh, can you hear me?
I'm hearing the echo, so let me try and deal with that.
Okay. We're not hearing it. At least I'm not.
I heard it.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
I think I took care of it.
Great. All righty. So this is Michael Chang, Vice Chair of the Police Accountability Board. It's a special meeting. It is Wednesday the 17th at a little bit after 7 p.m. So in terms of the public advisory, I'm going to read that. Pursuant to, it's been changed a little bit recently, as Director Lee informed us. Pursuant to Government Code Section 5493E and the state declared emergency, this meeting will be conducted exclusively through teleconference and Zoom video conference. The COVID-19 state of emergency continues to directly impact the ability of the members to meet safely in person and presents imminent risk to the health of the attendees. Therefore, no physical meeting location will be available. To access the meeting remotely via the internet, join from a PC, Mac, iPad, iPhone, or Android device using the URL indicated on the agenda for this meeting. If you do not wish for your name to appear on the screen, use the drop-down menu and click on Rename to rename yourself to be anonymous. To request to speak, use the raise hand icon on the screen. To join by phone, dial the number indicated on the agenda for this meeting and enter the meeting ID. If you wish to comment during the public comment portion of the agenda, press *9 and then wait to be recognized by the chair. Thank you. Can we, Director Lee, take the call to order?
Call the roll? Yes.
Sorry, call the roll.
Calavita,
Here.
Chang,
Here?
Harris,
Here.
Leftwich,
Here.
Levine,
Here.
Mizell,
Here.
Moore,
Here.
Owens,
Here.
and alternate member Batista.
here.
Okay, thank you very much. We have quorum, Chair.
Great, thank you. And nice to meet alternate board member Batista. And as a reminder again, Chair Ramsey is not here today, so I'm acting as chair. So let's approve the agenda. Are there any questions, concerns, or comments on the agenda? Fairly slim this time. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Seconded.
Great. So moved by board member Leftwich, seconded by board member Calavita. And without any other disagreement or otherwise heard or seen, the motion is approved. Shall we move into public comment, Director Lee?
I would just like to recognize that Sergeant Veronica Rodriguez and Officer Alex McDougall are here from the police department and Deputy City Attorney Sam Harvey.
Great. Thank you for remarking on that. And thank you, all three of you, for attending. It's much appreciated. So shall we move into public comment now?
Yes.
So this is the first time I've been co-host. I have the timer thing that Chair Ramsey uses in front of me. I'm then going to share my screen. And then Director Lee, please tell me if you see it.
Yes, we could see it.
Cool. So which members of the public shall be speaking first?
Well, they should be raising their hands. I made you co-host and you should be able to see the list of attendees.
Huh. Let me see here.
If you can't see them, I can see them, but I don't see any raised hands.
Oh, I see. I'm looking at the participants.
Right, and then the other column is attendees.
Yes, that's correct. And I don't see anyone raising their hand. So of the 4 members of the public who are attendees, does anyone want to speak? Okay. So if not, we will proceed to the next agenda item, being new business. And we'll jump right into the training by Deputy City Attorney Sam Harvey. I'm going to stop my share so Deputy City Attorney Harvey can share his screen. And then I think Director Lee, you have to allow him to do so.
I think everybody is allowed. Let me see.
Okay.
Yes, all panelists are allowed. That's what I'm seeing
Great.
on my end.
Are you able to upload Deputy City Attorney Harvey?
You're muted.
You're muted, Mr. Harvey.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone see? Is that working?
There we go. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Let's see if we can do this. So thank you, everyone. As I think Kathy has noted, part of getting this board up and running is a significant amount of training on things, substantive to police oversight and accountability, and as well related to general governance and running of public meetings. So tonight we're going to run through a discussion of the Brown Act, California's open meetings law that applies to all local government bodies. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen a presentation similar to this before, or encountered issues related to the Brown Act if you've served on other city bodies or other local or other representative bodies. So some of this may be review. I think the purpose of this presentation isn't necessarily to make everyone an expert in the Brown Act. I think that's something that takes years and lots of frustrating work, but at least help to help members of the board be prepared to sort of anticipate and identify potential Brown Act issues, know where the main sort of flag posts are on what behaviors to be wary of, and when to reach out to Kathy or to the city attorney's office for guidance. I also provided to Kathy, and I know she added it as a supplement, a document from the League of California Cities, which is their Brown Act guide. It's a pretty substantial document that goes into a lot more detail on certain areas of the Brown Act. It can be a good reference. It's a good jumping off point even for us when we're kind of looking at a new Brown Act issue, to just kind of see what the top level sort of summary is on certain topics. That document isn't, it's not legal advice from our office, but I think it's a helpful sort of starting point if you're looking at analyzing Brown Act issues. I would just caution that document is a few years old now. They update those materials every few years. I think the one we provided is from 2016. So, certainly don't just rely on that, but it's a good, if you're looking for some additional reading and some additional sources to help you think through some of these issues, that's a helpful source. Without further ado, the Brown Act, which is California's open government law. It applies to all local government entities, all cities and counties. At the state level, there's an act called the Bagley-Keene Act, which is almost identical. But here in the city of Berkeley, we use the Brown Act. So a little history of the Brown Act. Starting in the 1950s, the San Francisco Chronicle started running a few investigative pieces about the ways in which different local governments were conducting their meetings. And they uncovered a lot of secret meetings happening, a lot of decision-making happening behind closed doors. In some instances, these were meetings that were just not at all ever, advertised to the public. In one example, in the city of San Jose, council was discussing a particularly contentious issue, and some of the members didn't want to sort of be in public taking certain positions, and they said, you know what, we're going to go in the back and sort this out, and then we'll come out and tell you guys what we decide. So there were kind of a series of incidents before we had a set of open meetings laws that led to some calls for reform. So the League of California Cities drafted some legislation, and it was championed by Assemblymember Ralph Brown and signed into law by Governor Earl Warren in 1953. One thing to note here, we're talking about the 1950s. Yes, the Brown Act has been updated over the years, but there's also ways in which I think it's not always drafted with clear guidance for some of the newer situations we encounter with new technology. Certainly, we didn't have Zoom in the 1950s. So there's, we're constantly encountering sort of new areas where we have to interpret the Brown Act based on unforeseen circumstances. So there's a picture of Mr. Assemblymember Brown, and here's the summary of kind of the purpose of the Brown Act. It's actually enshrined right in the government code at the beginning of the Brown Act. It says the people in delegating authority do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them. So the driving policy is when representative bodies, when decision-making bodies of local governments are acting, they're doing it in full view of public. And that, that can include things that might be uncomfortable, embarrassing, disadvantageous for individual representatives. But the point is that the public gets access to all of this because ultimately it's the public's work that's being done by these bodies. So basics of the act. The main purpose is to ensure that the public's business is done in the public. Basically, the sort of main requirements of the act are that all meetings of legislative bodies have to be open to the public. They have to be adequately noticed. Under the Brown Act, that means at least 72 hours ahead of a meeting. The agenda has to be posted, notice provided to the public. There are emergency circumstances where that can be shortened, but generally it's 72 hours. Here in the city of Berkeley, you'll notice council agendas are posted a week out. Generally, we sort of err on the side of posting earlier. And then that's sort of twofold. One, it gives the public more advance notice. And two, it gives staff time in case something comes up we didn't foresee. We can change the agenda before the 72-hour deadline. The other requirement is you have to stick to the agenda. I'm sure you've encountered in meetings, a topic comes up sort of tangential to an item raised by a member of the public, and conversation might start to veer down a path of really discussing that item. You really have to stick to what's on the agenda. When it comes to public comment, you're allowed to have brief discussion of things that members of the public bring up. You're allowed to flag an item for staff to bring back at a future meeting or respond briefly to a member of the public who's raised a concern maybe that's not on the agenda, but you're not allowed to engage in any decision-making on that item or any sort of lengthy or real substantive discussion. And then finally, you have to allow the public to speak, speak both on matters of general concern within the subject matter jurisdiction of the body, and then also on individual items that are on the agenda. So anytime we're having a meeting, those are kind of the rules that apply. Generally, city staff ensure that most of these rules are in place and ready to, by the time the meeting is scheduled. So who's covered by the Brown Act? The Brown Act uses this term legislative body. If you look at that League of California Cities Guide, you'll see the phrase legislative body used throughout. And the actual language of the law uses this phrase legislative body. That's not just sort of the main legislative body of the city council, though it is the city council. It's also any subcommittees of the city council. It's any commissions and boards like this board, any decision-making body of the city. So it basically includes just about every type of decision-making body. It can include sort of multi-jurisdictional bodies. There's some entities or discussion groups that are created that don't have sort of the type of decision-making authority that rises to this level that aren't technically Brown Act bodies. But generally, if you're talking about a city board or commission or any sort of subset of the council, we're talking about a legislative body that has to be sort of Brown Act. So the key question we encounter with the Brown Act is, what is a meeting? What has a circumstance arrived where we need to provide notice, stick to an agenda, allow the public to speak, or has a meeting happened due to actions of members of one of these bodies, and we didn't, outside of the context of an ordinarily recognized meeting. That's where we ended up. So a meeting occurs whenever a quorum or a majority of members of the legislative body gather to discuss business that's within their jurisdiction. And that's within their subject matter jurisdiction. A quorum is a majority of the members. And in addition to sort of your regularly noticed meetings, you can also have meetings occur if you have a quorum gathering and discussing topics within their jurisdiction. So this can happen at social gatherings, it can happen at meetings of other legislative bodies, it can happen at retreats, workshops. If enough members show up to the same restaurant coincidentally and start chatting, it can happen there. So there's all these sort of situations we have to look out for, because the idea is, anytime a majority of this body is meeting and discussing things within their jurisdiction, the public needs to be noticed and given an opportunity to attend, given the opportunity to speak, given an opportunity to hear and see what's going on. And the last area there on the bottom is serial meetings. And this is a topic that I think is probably the most fraught within the Brown Act. It's probably the one we get the most questions on, probably the area that's the most sort of complicated. And I think one of the main areas to look out for outside of the regular course of the regular meeting. So serial meetings, as I said, they're kind of one of the more challenging areas of the Brown Act. We're constantly encountering sort of novel scenarios in which the serial meetings rules are implicated or potentially implicated. And basically, it's when a majority of the legislative body uses a series of communications, not all meeting at the same time, all meeting at the same place, but a set of communications amongst themselves, amongst each other, either directly or through an intermediary, to discuss, deliberate, or take action on any item within their subject matter jurisdiction. And so the issue here is that you could have a meeting under the Brown Act, even though you're not all in the same room at the same time. An actual meeting has occurred under the law, and that would deprive the public of the right to observe and participate in the legislative decision-making process. So there's a couple ways this can happen. The first example is the daisy chain meeting. And the example here is member A calls member B to talk about something. Member B says, oh yeah, I'm totally on board. That's a great idea. Member B then calls member C, says, hey, member A and B and I are talking about this. Member C then calls member D, then calls member E, and so on until a majority have sort of had this chain of communication about a topic outside of a meeting. Oftentimes, this can happen, or you run the risk of this happening when folks are chatting before meetings of legislative bodies. Maybe they're trying to sort of coordinate and feel out where their colleagues might sit on an issue, which in limited circumstances is fine. But once you get to the majority conversation, you've actually had a meeting outside of an ordinary recognized meeting, and that's a Brown Act violation. So that's kind of the one scenario we talk about, this chain scenario, and that can be, it can be spoken, it can be written, it can be telephone, it can be email. So that's the main areas to look out for. The second way that this serial meetings can happen is the hub and spoke meeting. So unlike the daisy chain where you kind of have this cascade of members talking one to the other to the next, in this model you have one member discussing with different members, and one member of the board so serving as the hub in the middle of this spoke, this wheel. And so, if cumulatively here you have 5-6 members in this diagram communicating, that could be a serial meeting. And then, it can also, this is the area where we run into not just members of the board, not just members of the council creating serial meeting, but that person in the center of the spoke can be a city employee or an officer. It could be, if the head of a department, was serving as the sort of go-between here, that could create a serial meeting. One issue, we run into with PAB is you have sort of public members who aren't voting members, but who are still participating members. I think it's kind of an open question about whether they would get added to the quorum count here if they participate in the conversation, but undoubtedly they could be seen as a hub in the center of this wheel. And even a member of the public, they're being a proactive sort of go-between between these members can facilitate the Brown Act violation. In that case, the member of the public isn't violating the Brown Act. They don't have obligations under the Brown Act, but their actions would be facilitating a violation of the Brown Act by those members that they've spoken to and facilitate the communication between them. And so, as I noted, the Brown Act started in 1953. Back then, it was a lot of face-to-face meetings. There was a lot of, maybe written correspondence, telephone calls. But since then, the world of communication technology has changed, substantially. So we're encountering these situations with emails and texts and all sorts of forms of online communication that raise kind of new issues about what turns into a meeting around that. So, any rule that applies to email, text, any kind of medium you might use. One thing you may notice, a reply all email. Let's say the whole board receives an email from a member of the public raising an issue. Well, if one member of the board hits reply all on the email and says, thank you, member of the public, I think it's a really important issue, and these are my opinions about it, that can be itself a serial meeting. Now, communicated to the entire membership of the board about a substantive matter within jurisdiction, just by simply replying to an email. So you'll notice one of the preventative things staff often use is they'll BCC every member of the board when you receive an email from staff. That way, there's just less of a risk of someone hitting reply all when they shoot back a question to staff about the substance of the question. So that's why we often do that. And then social media has raised this sort of new set of issues and new sort of ways in which the act has to be sort of squeezed into these new paradigms of communication technology. And so, a serial meeting can occur on social media through a chain of tweeting and liking and commenting, whether it's on blogs or Twitter, Facebook, whatever method is being used out there. And then recently, in 2020, the state legislature passed AB 992, which creates actually a pretty, I think, stringent new set of requirements on use of social media that I think, in my opinion, go beyond what sort of basic analysis of the Brown Act's basic requirements applied to social media settings would require of you. Basically, AB 992 says officials can communicate with the public through social media. So you can have a Twitter account, you can post things about the meetings to Twitter, you can talk about issues that are coming up. Totally fine to communicate with the public about PAB matters that you think are important for the public to know about, but you can't engage with your fellow members on social media. So that's, you can't retweet, you can't like, you can't quote, tweet, or share whatever the sort of medium allows you to do. It's kind of a strict requirement because you could have a one-on-one conversation with someone. You could imagine someone giving a statement in an analogous public forum, standing on the corner speaking to the public, your fellow board member, and you walk up next to them and say, yeah, I totally agree, couldn't agree more. And that's essentially what you're doing on social media. In person, that would perfectly fine. There's just two of you on social media. That's considered a violation of the Brown Act. I think the policy here is that even though there's only kind of a one-on-one interaction when you comment on or retweet someone's social media, it's sort of open on display to every member of the committee or every member of the legislative body. So you're sort of effectively kind of communicating with everyone potentially. We're still sort of, seeing how this is actually going to be applied. We haven't seen any sort of cases with it or much real guidance from the general or anyone else on kind of how this is going to work. So stay tuned, I guess, on more guidance, but just generally be careful using social media and refrain from engaging with your fellow board members. And then, if you have questions about how this works, please feel free to reach out to us. I think we'll probably be developing best practices in this area going forward as this, our understanding of this new law matures a little bit.
Thank you so much, Mr. Harvey. We have a question.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yes. Is that okay? Can we do some
Yeah,
questions?
absolutely. Yeah, whenever you feel.
I think that was very.
We can
concise.
take it at the end as well and in the midst of the presentation.
I'm sorry. Oh, are there more portions of your presentation?
Yeah, there's a couple more slides, but I'm happy to take questions now if it's sort of, better to take it in the moment while we're on a specific
Sure.
slide, and we can also take them at the end as well.
Let's do that right now, really quickly, if you don't mind.
Yep.
Of course, board members Leftwich and Calavita are cognizant that there's two more slides. So board member Leftwich, can you go first, please? And then-
Yes, just quick question about public comment. So for these meetings, we always have public comment in the beginning and at the end of our meetings, but I've served on other boards and commissions where we just have it either in the beginning or at the end. And I'm wondering if we really need to have it twice, since there seems to be a lot of variety about that.
Yeah, so the rule is that you allow public comment for anything within the board's jurisdiction and for each individual item. I think different bodies interpret that differently. I think some commissions will have a general public comment period at the beginning for non-agenda items and then individual public comment for each item. That seems to actually be the best practice. Right now you have at the beginning and end. I think if the idea is at the beginning you're asking for comment on things that are on the agenda and at the end you're asking for general comment, I think that's the idea, that you get comment on individual agenda items before those items come up. That's an important part of public comment, right? Having people comment after the decision's already been made isn't really fully allowing the public to engage with the board. So yeah, I mean, I would probably recommend, that the board think about its practice and we could review the Brown Act and see if we think the way that comments done here could be streamlined or needs to be changed to be brought into more compliance.
Is it possible that if you do it at the beginning before votes have
Yeah,
been
that might be
taken?
possible. Just do one at the beginning. I mean, I think
Okay, thank you.
that's possible.
Thank you. And before we shift to board member Calavita, I just want to note that BPA member Matthew Valley has joined us previously. Thank you. Board member Calavita, if you would like to go next, please.
Oh, thank you for that, Mr. Harvey. I have a question about subcommittees with public members. You mentioned it a little bit, but I'm not clear. For example, if we have a subcommittee with 3 board members and 2 public members, only the board members get to vote. So can 2 of the 3 board members speak among themselves outside of a meeting since there's 5 members total on that committee? Or is that a violation because that's 2 of the 3 voting members?
That's a good question. I would say that the voting members make up the sort of relevant count, and that a majority of that is 2. And so 2 members communicating outside would be problematic. I guess I wasn't aware that the math broke down that way, 3 and 2. It would be a good thing for us to sort of confirm in our office. But I would think the safest approach would be to assume that a quorum is 2. two voting members.
And what about the 3 public members? Are they free to talk among themselves? I mean,
Yeah, I think the public members are free to communicate amongst themselves, but would have to, be wary of facilitating communication that includes voting members.
okay, and then just very quickly, on the public comment stuff, I think you said something about, and I don't know how this relates to the Brown Act, but the public comment, you said something about board members responding to public comment or not responding or engaging with the member of the public. What are the rules about that?
Yeah, so that comes up because the Brown Act requires that the board stick to the agenda, right? So if a member of the public brings up something that's not on the agenda, that's where it comes up. If they bring up something that's on the agenda, you can just openly, proceed how you want with that communication, bring people into the fold to the extent you want,
Okay.
totally enter into a dialogue. But oftentimes, either within the context of an individual agenda item, maybe an adjacent kind of topic comes up that's not really part of the agenda item, or in the course of general public comment, an important item comes up and the board wants to respond or individual member wants to respond. Even though it's not an agenda, you're allowed to briefly respond, but you're not supposed to engage in discussion amongst yourselves about the item. But you can briefly respond, make a comment to the member of the public. You can ask staff to agendize something for a future meeting. So you can sort of have this brief sort of just commenting in response to a public comment without running afoul of the Brown Act requirement that you stick to the agenda.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. And if there are no other questions, we'll allow Mr. Harvey to proceed.
Great.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. Thank you.
Yeah. So, the Brown Act rules are fairly strict, and I think they often can frustrate, for legislative bodies, situations that seem like they have sort of more efficient solutions, and Brown Act issues can kind of rear their head in unexpected places. But there's a few sort of key areas of exception where you will not be violating the Brown Act that are key to keep in mind. And some of these are a little more detailed than they're laid out here, but generally individual contacts amongst yourselves, amongst each other are fine as long as you're not, 2 members of a 3-member body. But, be careful of serial meetings. You can communicate one-on-one or amongst 3 of you, but you do have to be mindful of what that chain looks like. And actually, Board Member Calavita, I would also note that the Brown Act requirements differ depending on whether a committee is a standing committee or an ad hoc committee. So for standing committees of the board, the Brown Act applies. For ad hoc committees, it doesn't. So if there's a discrete sort of item a committee's been formed to address and report back to the board, and it's a committee that's not sort of a permanent fixture of the board, then the Brown Act generally does not apply. So we can kind of maybe think through that, looking at the board's committees. I would suspect, if they have a sort of discrete project, the Brown Act might not even apply. Generally, a lot of those committees still notice their meetings and follow the rules of the Brown Act in the spirit of having the public, giving the public the most visibility on the process as possible. So some of the other exceptions here: attending conferences or other open and public meetings hosted by nonprofits or other entities. A quorum of the body can go to an event like that, but they can only talk about tab business as part of a scheduled program. So if a quorum of the body was on a panel, those are situations where it's permissible, but that quorum then can't go hang out by the punch bowl and keep the conversation going. You have to stick to the schedule. There's sort of these stories from some of these smaller cities where councils will have their meeting and then they'll go across the street to the donut shop and kind of invite the public over to hang out and keep chatting, and that's a violation, even though it was, it's kind of tacked on to a commensurate scenario. So other situations where you can, still meet as a forum and discuss are social or ceremonial gatherings. You can attend, but then you can't discuss, but you can be there. And then open meetings of other bodies. So if all of you went to the council, or all of you went to another commission meeting, you could attend but not discuss. You can be there in person, but aren't permitted to discuss unless you're part of a scheduled meeting. So the council could have a meeting where they invite a forum on to discuss as part of a scheduled item, and then that would be permissible. So closed session. So, one of the main pillars of the Brown Act is that these meetings are open and public. The public is allowed to attend and be present and hear everything that the members have to say. But there are certain situations where the body can go into closed session. And these are specifically delineated in the Brown Act. Those are the only reasons you can go into closed session. These are sort of the main ones that are usually used. I think there's a couple others, but existing or anticipated litigation. If the city attorney thinks that litigation is imminent or is likely, you can go into closed session. For public employee hiring and disciplinary processes, as this body engages in disciplinary recommendations and investigations, that can be in closed session. In fact, having that in closed sessions for police officers is mandated by the California Penal Code. For labor negotiations, legislative bodies can meet with the representatives who will be representing their position in those negotiations, to hear how negotiations are going, to give feedback and direction to those negotiators. That's sort of likely something we will be utilizing for this body in the context of we prefer to keep the body abreast of, keep the board abreast of how discussions are going and provide their direction to staff on the board's position and where they'd like to, their strategy and desires in the context of those negotiations. Real estate negotiations, if the city is buying or selling property. And then there's a public security exception if there's matters of sort of citywide security that the council needs to meet on generally. Closed session can be utilized there as well. One thing to note, there is not just a general attorney-client closed session option. You can't just sort of, our office can't just say, we need to have a confidential discussion with you because it's important and it's attorney-client privilege. We have to identify a specific rationale that says, which is the justification for going to closed session. So it's not, we want to go in closed session, let's find the reason. It's more a labor negotiation issue has arisen, or anticipated litigation has arisen, and now we need to go in closed session to discuss. For closed session items, they must be briefly described on the agenda. You'll notice that's the case on this body's agendas. Closed session is discussed. The items are listed. And certain, the Brown Act contains specific language you can or should use to describe those items. And then certain aspects of final decisions need to be discussed in public. So where like a final labor negotiation agreement has been reached, that's supposed to be reported out to the public, things like that. So those are the closed session exceptions, limited number of them. Certainly this body utilizes it frequently in its role as part of a public employee disciplinary process.
Thank you, Mr.
questions?
Harvey. Yeah. Good, great. Thanks. Thanks for asking for questions. Director Lee has had her hand up for a while, and I had a quick question as well that I think you generally framed out already. But Director Lee, please ask your question.
Just had to unmute there. Sam, did you say, I'm back before closed session. Did you say that ad hoc subcommittees are not to the Brown Act?
That's right. Ad hoc subcommittees, and there's a specific definition that, it's not always clear that subcommittee is met, but it's generally subcommittees that are created by the parent body. PAB is the parent body in this case, creates a subcommittee for a specific delineated purpose. And it's a sort of finite sort of period. Right? It's not something that goes on. I think the cutoff is 1 year. Can't go on for longer than a year. Its job is to meet, address a single topic, report back to the board, report back to its parent body. Those are generally not required to follow Brown Act. Though often they do, and traditionally a lot of City of Berkeley subcommittees, regardless of their status, have followed those rules.
Right. So
It's kind of a best practice.
all of the PAB subcommittees are ad hoc committees, and that was true for the PRC as well. And we always followed the Brown Act. So I was a little surprised to hear you say that.
Yeah, there's been some change, I think, in how the city, I think during COVID, and how the city has decided to approach sort of whether we're requiring ad hocs to follow those rules, even though they're not required to, or just kind of as a general guideline, they still should. I mean,
Thank you.
Yeah,
I'm remembering that now. There wasn't because of the COVID issues and noticing and meeting remotely or not.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Lee. I had a quick follow-up question, Mr. Harvey. On the attorney-client closed session issue. So I seem to, I'm hearing and I understand, I think, that you can't obviously just have any old meeting to say, hey, it's an attorney-client issue, but it has to be individualized to a specific concern or conflict, such as like labor relations, for example. Is there, so what I'm hearing then is there's no presumptive attorney-client category, and that there should be a lot of specificity to why you would have that. Is there, I'll say, go ahead.
Right, there's no sort of closed session category, attorney-client category. I think is what you mean. Right, there's just specific sort of reasons. I mean, most of these are sort of driven by attorney-client privilege. They're kind of, these negotiations, the purpose is generally to meet with, the city attorney or, to discuss litigation or labor negotiations, but there's no blanket attorney-client privilege. I will say, a caveat is, written communications, confidential memoranda are still acceptable. That's not a meeting, even though those are going to the whole body from the city attorney's office. And then, one-on-one communications with our office and members of the board are perfectly fine. Even, two members of the board want to, reach out to us to discuss something. That's perfectly fine because it's not a quorum.
Okay. And certainly with regard to attorney-client, I guess my question is, how specific does the individualized nature of the attorney-client issue have to be? For example, if you're just talking about labor relations in general, like some of the conversations we've had with the PAB with regard to meet and confer, if it's just a general conversation about the nature of what triggers meet and confer, et cetera, that would be outside of the scope of a closed session.
I mean, if it's relevant to the reason for the closed session, it's permissible. So, one thing that often comes up in these labor negotiations is whether something is meet and confer, right? That's often kind of a point of disagreement between the public sector employer and the bargaining unit. And so in that case, there would be kind of discussion right amongst us and you about what the rules are and how they apply, and what our opinions are about how they apply to certain set of circumstances. We have a memorandum out there about that topic, so that would be kind of relevant to that discussion. But sort of just general sort of conceptual, wide-ranging discussion wouldn't be part of that. You have to identify specific reasons, and each of these kind of topics, labor negotiations, anticipated litigation, within the Brown Act, kind of elaborate what the threshold is. So labor negotiations is ongoing labor negotiations or pending labor negotiations, where there's a discussion with the individuals who will be participating in those negotiations. Anticipated litigation has language about when has something ripened into expected or anticipated litigation, and there's a few different scenarios, either an express threat or sufficient facts that the city attorney thinks there's a litigation risk. So there's sort of specific identifying standards that have to be met to identify situation that can be slotted into one of these criteria.
Sure. Okay, that's helpful. The factual thresholds that I think are helpful, and the hypotheticals you just described. Thank you. And do you have another slide?
I have one more slide here. Just the scary enforcement slide. Enforcement of the Brown Act is kind of an interesting feature. The main kind of first step, the way a Brown Act violation is flagged by a member of the public, or even another public official, is through a demand to cure and correct. That's the classic way that Brown Act violations are approached. So this would take the form of a letter or written transmission from someone who thinks that members of a body have violated the Brown Act. Maybe they say, I've got an email chain right here that's got a majority of this body on it discussing matters. This is a Brown Act. We need to cure and correct. So the Brown Act allows bodies to correct a violation before imposing sort of, going to court or imposing some kind of disciplinary process. It's just what steps need to be taken to cure an individual violation vary depending on what the violation is. So in the case of emails, where a chain email that has become a serial communication or reply all situation, generally the cure there is just going to be to publish those emails in the agenda packet. Maybe make a statement on the record and then about it. It gets more complicated where you have actually kind of off the record discussions between the majority. Then there's kind of, well, how do we bring this out into public? Maybe we have to summarize the discussions that were made, redo any kind of decisions that were made. If a meeting sort of wasn't properly noticed and the whole meeting is invalid, then you might have to retake a vote, things like that. So that's, luckily the Brown Act is geared towards, it's not geared towards penalizing, it's geared towards bringing bodies into compliance and ensuring sort of things are made public, right? It's got steps in it to rectify potential violations if they're caught before they become an issue. The other option that our city has is the Open Government Commission, which is not part of the demand to cure and correct process, but it is a city commission charged with looking at issues of open governance. They can kind of review potential violations of the Brown Act. If they think one's happened, they can identify it and flag it for city staff and for the council. They also deal with sort of policy recommendations around open meeting policies. If there's sort of a practice a commission is engaged in that someone thinks might be violating the Brown Act, then they can recommend that a certain commission or board or the council sort of change course in how they approach a certain situation to not run afoul of the Brown Act. The third heading is lawsuits. Civil suits can be filed. A complainant has to first go through the demand to cure and correct process before they can file a lawsuit. They can't just run out of court. They have to give the city an opportunity to fix it. But if the city disagrees, that there's been a violation, and we don't take steps to fix something, then someone could file a lawsuit. Or if they think our cure and correct sort of the cure we've used isn't sufficient, they can file a lawsuit. And then lastly, the law does allow for criminal penalties if there's sort of overt, conscious, intentional violations of the Brown Act. That's very rare. I don't know that there's ever really been many full cases of that, because there's a sort of criminal intent element there, and most violations of the Brown Act are sort of incidental, accidental things that officials unwittingly sort of walk into. But that's sort of working out there to be aware of. So that's it. I'm happy to take any additional questions, certainly offline as well, right now, and offline with more specifics. And then I would just direct you also to that League of Cities guide, which is a pretty substantive, deeper dive into some of these topics that I think is a helpful kind of next step.
Great, thank you so much. We have Board Member Levine has her hand raised.
Thank you, Mr. Harvey. This has been informative. I have a question about sort of follow up of what Chair Chang brought up, which has to do with this. Could you put up the prior screen? This one, yeah. The closed session permissible doesn't include attorney-client closed sessions. We had a real example of this where your office provided us with an attorney-client memo. And we sort of discussed it at one of the open meetings in the generalized sense of defining what meet and confer meant in the context of the memo. But we've never had a closed session on the question of whether there is an actual conflict of interest. And I wonder if it isn't possible to do that, or even required to do that, because a client has to be able to discuss openly everything with an attorney, which so far we haven't been able to do. And essentially behind the whole conversation is the issue of anticipated litigation, because meet and confer, when I looked it up, the California cases, interestingly, many of them had to do with police department cases coming out of boards or commissions like ours. So, the question then is, why can't we have an attorney-client meeting to discuss that memo? Or are we going to? I guess we've brought it up, but I don't know if it ever was resolved.
Sure. So I would say, those two memos were drafted as being relevant to, a labor negotiation closed session, because they're speaking to the meet and confer issues that can arise in those discussions, disagreements about which items within a multi-pronged proposal are meet and conferable, and then sort of substantive, legal analysis of the proposal. So I would say, within the context of a labor negotiation closed session, the material of those memos is informative and germane to that discussion. And certainly, if we were in a situation in the future where there was anticipated litigation related to those topics, that would also be an acceptable justification. A closed session about anticipated litigation related to those topics would be an acceptable a venue for discussing those memos. I mean, it's sort of, the memos are relevant to the labor negotiation. It's not sort of the other way around that we're having a meeting to discuss the memos.
Well, okay, so what's the long and short of it? Does that mean you think we can have a meeting to discuss it?
Well, I think
in closed session?
Yes, I think we should have a closed session discussion about sort of ongoing labor negotiations at some point. And I think the memoranda we have provided is relevant to that discussion.
Okay.
And we've worked with Director Lee to set up a time for that and identify a time when our relevant sort of personnel are available for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And then we had this conversation that lit up the board. We have Board Member Leftwich, and then alternate board member Batista had raised her hand. So board member Leftwich, please go first. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So Mr. Harvey, you and I had a conversation about this, and I was saying that to me, it seems pretty clear that discussions with us regarding your memos would fall within the anticipated litigation exception, and that seems much more appropriate than labor negotiations, since this isn't about labor negotiations. So I thought you guys were looking into that, and I think you had mentioned that you were conferring with outside counsel about that. And the only other thing I would say is just that it seems it would be like a catch-22 if we couldn't have a closed session because your office gave us memos that were marked attorney-client privilege, so we can't discuss them, and we couldn't discuss them in an open meeting. Yet if we don't fall under an exception to the for a closed session, then where are we? We can't discuss it at all. And again, if we are your client and you are our attorney, we need to be able to discuss these issues with you in a candid way. So I hope that this can be resolved pretty quickly, because they're important issues that are timely. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. I'll just a couple, I think, thoughts. Keeping in mind, I think, at this point, I think there's in my opinion, I think in staff's opinion, there's actually a real need for us to go into closed session with this body for the labor negotiation enumerated purpose, which is to get guidance from PAB on how it feels about the status of actually ongoing discussion. So that's sort of the core of the labor negotiation rationale, and I think that's really that's a substantive sort of need that we as staff have and want to get some guidance from PAB. So in that sense, a labor negotiation closed session meeting, I think, is appropriate and desired. Whether or not something is ripened into anticipated litigation, I think that takes we would have to look at, it takes an honest sort of assessment from us about whether something's gotten to that point, and different, just because there's conversations going back and forth in the context of a deferred does not mean we think litigation is imminent, particularly if we think there's a path forward that we can all that this board can kind of work through. So it would be amenable to and would guide us towards reaching. So at this point, we're certainly will, if we think there's a reason to meet for anticipated litigation, we would do that. But just the same, we think a labor negotiation closed session is really what's necessary at this point to discuss, confer and receive guidance from the board, which is what that labor negotiation exception is designed for. So the board can give the negotiators who are, give the negotiators guidance on sort of the board's position on those negotiations that might be more appropriate this time. And then I would just add, as I noted, attorney-client privilege memo, that knows me stamped attorney-client privilege. And then if it's relevant to a later discussion in a closed meeting, the fact that stamped attorney-client that's just how the memo is stamped. If it's eventually relevant to anticipated litigation or to labor negotiations or to a real estate transaction, it'll be part of the discussion. It will inform that discussion to the degree it's relevant. And I would just encourage any commissioners who want to reach out to me and the city attorney directly in a one-on-one context. That's perfectly permissible under the Brown Act, and I'm happy to have those conversations. In the meantime, as we're sort of, while we haven't had a closed session, and that conversation can be a pure sort of attorney-client or a pure confidential sort of discussion about the memos, questions about the memos, the reasoning, even untethered from labor negotiation context, which is what we would be adhering to in the closed session.
I'll just say, I think it's nice of you to allow us or encourage us to reach out to you individually, and I appreciate having had that opportunity, but it's very important for us as a body to discuss these issues with you as a group, so that, I want to hear what other board members are thinking, and I would like for them to hear what I'm thinking. So again, one-on-one is nice, but what we really need is a closed session as a body.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. And obviously in a public hearing context, it's important to have an airing out of this. We also have, trying to keep track of the time here. I know that Sergeant Rodriguez and Officer McDougall are waiting patiently. They have a 2-hour presentation too, and I'm sure they don't want to run to midnight. Board Member Batista and then Board Member Harris had their hands raised.
I'll try to be brief here, but I did read the original lawsuits on Meet and Confer that Sam had sent around, and I've got to tell you that it didn't seem to apply at all to this case. We're not talking about here when 75% of the voters passed passed to amend the charter for this actual commission or this board. They weren't talking about curtailing bargaining rights, pay, and benefits. We were talking specifically about police misconduct. You mean to tell me that Berkeley Police Association wants the right to be able to, partake in any misconduct without any accountability? Come on. That is just, what is the purpose? What are we doing here? If it is not to take those misconduct cases out of the chain of command with the police union and the Berkeley Police Department and address these issues in closed session. If not, you're paying stipends for no reason here. We are paying lip service to the voters. So completely disagree that this is just a labor negotiation and let them sue, but we should absolutely get to see those cases, those allegations of misconduct in closed session.
Thank you, Board Member Batista. And then allow Board Member Harris to speak.
I'll just be very brief. It's getting a little frustrating for me because it seems that we've sort of been lagging on this issue. I mean, the bottom line is that we know at this point we need a meeting one way or the other. So I just think we need to move on this as a board and stop dragging our feet with this, because I think that we're all in consensus as to what needs to happen at this point. And we just have too many important things to get done to have this lingering so long. So I'm just appealing to the city attorney, let's set the meeting. Let's set this up. Let's put it on calendar. Let's stop talking about it and get this done.
Chair?
Thank you, Board Member Harris. Is Director Lee is
Yes.
Yeah.
Please set aside Wednesday, December 1st. What I've been trying, and I think I have indicated this to the full board, so I've been trying to get a commitment from the city attorney and our and human resources as well to do a training on the Myers-Milius-Brown Act. And then after that, have a session on the city attorney memos, because they obviously relate to one another. What I'm hearing is, even if we can't get the personnel who are going to do the training, maybe we should just have the closed session. So I'm just going to throw that out there to Mr. Harvey for consideration. And in the meantime, everybody save that date.
Great, thank you. I think, Mr. Harvey, as you're hearing, we've had many conversations about this. I think this is a real priority. And it's been a number of months now. We're going into the holidays when it becomes more challenging to set schedules.
Right.
So I really encourage city's attorney's office to just get this out of the way and put it out front there. And then obviously we could have continuing conversations about it. So if December 1st works for you, it works for many of us, it works for me. I'm not going to put you on the spot now, but Director Lee will check in with you, and we're hoping for a December 1st date.
Right.
Sure, yeah,
We're not,
we-
I'm not asking, not asking for a commitment this second, but just putting that out there, and he and I will have continued conversation.
Right, yeah. Director Lee and I have been in discussion and this evening as well about a meeting on that date. So we're hoping we can confirm soon that will happen.
Thank you. Okay, so we have some direction on that, I hope, inertia on that towards December 1st. And in the meantime, are there any final questions? Because we do have, there's a lot of training left here. There's 30 more minutes. I'm sorry, there's 2 hours with
Yes.
Sergeant Rodriguez and Officer McDougal. Is there any more questions for Mr. Harvey? And Ms. Harvey, again, thank you for coming and engaging with us on these important issues on the Brown Act. I'm looking
Thank
for
you.
any raised hands.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't see any more raised hands. So thank you, Deputy City Attorney Harvey, for the training and answering these important questions. And we look forward to our continuing engagement with you on these issues.
Great, thank you all.
Thanks. So our next order of business is the 2-hour training, which I think is going to be very exciting. Sergeant Rodriguez and Officer McDougal, thank you so much. And I know you've been waiting patiently. We appreciate that. So hopefully you can share your screen.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that. Yeah, we try to wrap this up before midnight to spare you all. Let's see here. We got-
So they're doing a training on principled policing.
All right, can you guys all see that?
Yes.
Come through, okay?
Yeah.
All right, great. And no one needs a break or anything like that. We'll just kind of launch right into it.
Yes, please. If anyone needs to use the bathroom, et cetera, feel free to turn your camera off, et cetera.
Perfect.
Sound off too.
All right, great. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having us. Yeah, this training, it's basically an 8-hour in-person training, ideally, that we've kind of condensed for all of you into a 2-hour training. I know Alex and I know a few of you in this group, but for those of you that we haven't met, we wanted to kind of, and before we launch into the presentation, wanted to do an introduction. So for those that don't know who I am, Sergeant Veronica Rodriguez. I've been a cop for about 16 years. I was with UC Berkeley Police for about 4 years and been with Berkeley PD for about 12 years. I've had the very fortunate opportunity to do a number of different ancillary assignments and special assignments. I was a member of our bicycle patrol team, drug task force, special investigations bureau as a narcotics detective. I was also one of the few women that were part of our SWAT team for about 10 years. And currently I am a sergeant in our community services bureau. And then kind of in an ancillary capacity, I'm a lead instructor for not only this procedural justice course, but I'm also one of the lead instructors for the Inner Perspectives Leadership Development Program, which I was at today in San Jose teaching all day. I'm also a Cal graduate and student athlete, and I was raised in a working class, diverse family in Antioch. And with that, I will turn it over to Alex.
Thanks, Ronnie. So yeah, I also started my career at UC Berkeley PD. I've been a police officer for just over 18 years. I started with the city of Berkeley in 2006. And like Ronnie, I've worked in a lot of different assignments. I've done investigations. We were actually partners on Drug Task Force back when City of Berkeley had that unit, had the Drug Task Force. And I've been a field training officer and instructor in a bunch of different things. In the principled policing curriculum, as well as one of our first aid instructors and the coordinator of that program for a while, and defensive tactics instructor. And currently I also work in community services.
Cool. All right, so with that, this first slide, again, this kind of displays, just to kind of get you off and introduce you to the course a little bit. These are all the partners who were involved in the initial development kind of rollout of this course. And this curriculum was based off a procedural justice curriculum that was developed by Chicago PD in partnership with Yale University, in addition to an implicit bias curriculum that was kind of founded and kind of the brainchild of Dr. Jennifer Everhart at Stanford University. And this rolled out right around 2015, 2016 or so. So the start of this course usually kind of involves either the chief of police, or we have another kind of high-ranking representative of the department that introduces the program and really kind of stresses the importance of why we're here, why all the officers are taking this course, and what they hope to get out of it. In the event that the chief or representative is not available to kind of introduce the course, we often will play this video, which depicts at the time this presentation was made and the PowerPoint was made. It was then California Attorney General Kamala Harris, and Berkeley's own Kamala Harris. She provides the introduction in this video, and she kind of introduces the course. So right away, we really kind of dispel any misconceptions with officers about what this course is and is not. We tell them and let them know that this is not an ethics course or really an opportunity to kind of redefine policing. We emphasize that the concepts, learned in this program are perishable. And kind of one of the three things that we strongly emphasize that this course may provide to the officers that attend this course is that it may be validating for some who are already practicing these principles. It could raise awareness for others who aren't necessarily versed in these principles. Or third, it could be corrective and provide an opportunity to change some of those officers' mindsets, and in turn, they can be, more or less a change agent for our department. So this is kind of the generic course outline that essentially provides kind of a roadmap for how the curriculum will develop and kind of unfold, and the skills and kind of objectives that we hope the officers will walk away with at the end of this course. And of course, no start of any presentation we need to have some level of housekeeping in this course. So this course is designed to be a facilitated discussion. We strongly encourage class participation. And it's truly kind of what makes the class work and makes it most impactful. It's unfortunate that we were not able to provide this course to you all in person in the standard 8-hour structure. We're going to do our best to kind of explain it to you all. But we also emphasize in this course that there's going to be some experiences and some stories that will be shared that could be triggering or traumatic. We're also going to be displaying images and depicting, historical effects of policing that can be very emotional for some. And so we want to be cognizant of the fact that everyone has an experience to share and to be respectful of those experiences and their stories. The program and this curriculum is divided into 5 different modules. The first module being that we will discuss the elements of procedural justice. The second module talks about the cynicism and our cynicism specifically and how that impacts police legitimacy. The third module, we unpack the 4 principles, the kind of 4 foundational principles of procedural justice. The fourth module, we kind of emotionally examine the historical effects of policing in America and its impacts on our legitimacy in some communities. And in the last 5th module, we focus on the science behind implicit bias and how it is a barrier to procedural justice. And the 5th one really kind of dives into the science with Dr. Everhart and the Tom Tyler studies based out of Yale University. And then from here, we'll jump into module 1.
Ronnie, if I could add on real quick.
Sure.
So I just wanted to kind of make this point. As Ronnie just showed, this course was developed by the Attorney General's office and those other departments and organizations. When we were originally certified as instructors in this, they were keeping pretty tight control over the content. And in order for us to teach it and keep it a certified class through post, they really didn't want any changes, especially it was a brand new curriculum across the state. The instructor class we went to had instructors from many different police departments all over the place, from Richmond and LA sheriffs in a lot of places. Later on, we did get kind of some permission to change a few things and to kind of put some Berkeley specific content. And we were able to teach some modified versions of parts of the class. A lot of that was impacted by COVID as well, where we just weren't able to do the true class with the full discussions. And so what we're showing you guys is that original version of the class. It's all state content. We weren't allowed to really change it at all, but this is the version that we were able to present to, at least at the time, basically every officer at Berkeley PD.
Right. Module 1. Great. Thanks, Alex. All right, so this first module will discuss the concepts of procedural justice, legitimacy, and implicit bias, and essentially how these concepts help us achieve our goals in policing, particularly kind of at this redefining moment that we're all kind of in our profession. All right, so typically, this is one of the first questions that officers generally ask. We typically ask the class their thoughts on this course and what they thought this class may or may not.
Ronnie?
Yeah.
I don't know if you might not be sharing the second slideshow. At least I'm not seeing it. I don't know if the others can
Can everyone see this?
sort of chime in.
No, it's on the slideshow view.
Yeah, it's on housekeeping.
Let me see if I can restart this here. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes, module.
Yes.
Module.
Module 1.
Okay, all right. All right, so I'm not the most technologically savvy, so I appreciate the help there. All right, so this is module 1. Again, we're just going to discuss the concepts of procedural justice, legitimacy, and implicit bias, and how these concepts help us achieve our goals in policing, particularly at this kind of redefining moment in our profession. All right, so right away, again, we to kind of reiterate, we typically ask the class their thoughts on this course and what they think that this class would be, or kind of what they thought that they would be attending. And I've previously shared with classes that I thought this course was going to be another kind of version of community policing or community policing type philosophy. Once I really kind of took the time to understand what this course was and what it was about, I realized it was a philosophy that I frankly already adhere to and could really enhance. Once I understood this course and became an instructor, that I could enhance my own emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills. That would not only make me a better police officer, but also make me a better person. So this slide is really kind of intended to dispel the idea that this is kind of a rehashing or a rebranding of a previous course they may have taken, but this is an entirely new course for them. So these are some of the definitions. So the goal of this slide is to really establish that we receive our legitimacy and authority from the public, and we achieve our legitimacy by consistently practicing procedural justice. Again, this is going to be repeated over and over in these next 5 modules or so, with a goal being that perception matters, because most often perception becomes the reality for most, and we really gain our compliance and cooperation when the public perceives us as legitimate. And so these are the 4 foundational elements of procedural justice, which we will really kind of dissect in a later module. And procedural justice at its core is not a new concept. It really kind of validates what most of us are already doing or we know. And it really kind of boils down to how we treat people and how we talk to people really, really matters. And that's kind of re-emphasized in the course over and over, and particularly in the next several modules that we'll discuss. And kind of at its like foundational piece, procedural justice is really all about how people are treated along the process, which is in the name, ensuring kind of a just process, or procedural justice is the process is just. It's kind of how I like to remind myself of it. So this video here is from an episode. We're not going to play the whole thing. It's about 5 minutes long or so, but this video is from an episode of Cops. It kind of highlights procedural justice in action. In this particular incident, cops are dealing with an enormously large individual who is non-compliant and uncooperative and intoxicated. And kind of it displays like their conversation with this individual. They really kind of take the time to develop rapport. They slowly build trust with Big Mike. And the cops eventually end up tasing this individual after he fails to comply with their direction. But ultimately, the video ends with Big Mike apologizing for his actions, which is really kind of a complete reversal from how the encounter originally started. Again, this slide emphasizes the importance of procedural justice in building legitimacy within our community. When legitimacy is built, trust and voluntary compliance will follow, amongst other things that we will mention in the next slide. All right, so why are we here? So these are just some of the external benefits that we go over with a lot of our police officers. This slide outlines a lot of the external benefits, particularly when some officers, they often ask us how this concept or how this class will help them in the field. And we'll, again, emphasize that we mentioned that gaining legitimacy and trust with our community increases in voluntary compliance. And with voluntary compliance, we obviously have the potential for greater witness and victim assistance to solve crimes. When compliance increases, that increases safety. And with increased safety, it results in a lower stress level to officers. That lower stress level results in fewer complaints. And then as the saying goes, rinse, lather, repeat. This process is rather cyclical and obviously enormously beneficial if applied and practiced consistently. All right, so this is kind of one of the first group exercises in this course, and kind of how like the classroom is organized. We got all of the cops typically kind of in lumps in groups of 5 or so, kind of in these like small pods. So it makes it easy for us to kind of do breakout groups and group sessions. And for this particular activity, we ask the officers to break into groups and reflect on their personal goals in policing today. And all of these goals that they come up with are written on an easel pad and shared with the class. And we'll discuss kind of how these goals compare with the goals from when they first started in policing. And what we typically find is that most of the goals from the past and the present are rather similar, which brings us to the next slide here. So this slide more or less kind of summarizes the fact that we all have the same common goals. However, they tend to get lost or misguided over our long careers, particularly as we're exposed to a consistent level of kind of traumatic events. But really kind of the goal of this exercise is to reconnect the officers with their goals, because they really kind of serve as a reminder for why they entered the job. You know, why did we all sign up? It's often kind of a good reminder to reflect on, and it really kind of provides the foundational piece that they need for their role as a police officer. I can play this. It's a pretty short video here, but can you guys hear this?
No, I can't hear it.
It's
think I have to
faint,
do
so
it.
I think it's just, it's like
the
picking
sound.
back up through your speakers. You're not sharing your sound, would be my guess.
Yeah, which is fine. It's a pretty short video, but I'll just summarize it quickly here. So this video depicts the graduation of an OPD Academy class. I think it was about 10 years ago or so, or longer. And it provides kind of a voiceover that recites the California Code of Ethics. I mean, kind of as we listen to the recital, the officers will hear that procedural justice is embedded and kind of sprinkled throughout the California Code of Ethics. The first paragraph, for those that don't know the California Code of Ethics for law enforcement officers, the first paragraph talks about respect. The third paragraph talks about neutrality, and the last paragraph talks about trust. And the Code of Ethics it kind of reminds us that we're all in this noble profession that comes with a tremendous level of responsibility, and reminding us all that we have this ability to take a life or revoke freedom, which in its essence is all entrusted to us by the public. And so for us as instructors, we remind the officers that with this responsibility, we must be held to a higher standard, and we must absolutely expect the best of each other. And so we end this module with the officers watching this video, which provides kind of an impactful reminder for everyone. And with that, we'll go into module 2. Can everyone see this module 2?
No, I'm not. I'm seeing. I'm
No,
not seeing it. It's a slideshow view.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's video California Code of Ethics still.
Okay. All right, let me switch the screens here. Module 2. All right. All right, everyone can see that now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so module 2, in this module, we start to discuss and talk about why the public support is so important for policing and how procedural justice can increase how the practice of procedural justice can increase public support and ultimately officer well-being. We also kind of really start dissecting and understanding the role of cynicism and how that kind of plays a part in our profession and its impacts on our own health, the effectiveness, and obviously the relationships that we have with the public. So again, this slide is kind of a return to the last slide from module 1 from the OPD graduation. This is a slide that's essentially just designed to kind of depict these, brand new, motivated, optimistic, enthusiastic officers. They're kind of on display here. They're newly minted. They're ready to go. They're motivated to serve their community and help people. However, over time and over kind of this 10, 15, 20-year career, we often kind of see as police officers, this optimism slowly start to fade and develop into this, this significant and disastrous levels of cynicism. So now we kind of start discussing cynicism with the officers and how this kind of often develops when we have a tendency to have this high expectation of either a person or an organization, and that expectation is not met, which tends to be pretty frequent, not just in our profession, but in every kind of realm of life and profession. And this often kind of leads to the disappointment and believing the worst in people and the organizations, which again has kind of disastrous effects for us. So these are the sources of stress that we really take the time to really understand and discuss kind of at length, and really kind of engage in this emotional facilitated discussion with our officers that the cynicism that we develop generally comes from these 3 major areas. It's the street, the job, and our home life. And so we typically kind of turn this kind of into a class exercise where we ask the students to identify something that stresses them out. It could be kids, or it could be traffic stops, or it could be, any number of different things, or a horrible boss. And so we kind of ask them to name it out, we write them down, and we also ask them which category that stressor belongs to. Is it the street? Is it the department? Or is it home? Or it could encompass all 3. And so then we kind of start discussing at that point some of the negative impacts of the stress. And oftentimes we end up finding ourselves negatively impacted in 3 different ways. So a lot of this stress ends up resulting in the fact that we become less trusting of individuals, which is often a result of the hypervigilance that we often see. And this often, it's kind of an example that we use with hypervigilance is we're always hypervigilant, whether we're on or off duty. And you'll often notice a cop and recognize a cop right away in a restaurant, because they'll often be the ones with their kind of their bodies facing towards the door and always kind of scanning for a threat. And it's a hypervigilance that unfortunately we never turn off. It's kind of a survival mechanism and kind of a survival and something that's really ingrained to us. And we were trained on it from a very early part in our career. The second thing is we tend to become more controlling. And again, it's kind of part of our job is to stay safe by maintaining control, which translates into wanting to control other parts of our lives. The third thing is we become less emotional. So again, kind of with all this exposure to these repetitive traumas, we tend to internalize a lot, and we don't want to talk about it. And so we kind of shield ourselves from it. We become emotionally detached or removed and just overall less emotional and just kind of closed off, and particularly and tragically so closed off to the ones that that love us the most and would in theory provide us the most level of social and emotional support. And so all of these stressors lead to 3 tragic law enforcement secrets that we discuss with the officers. And these three tragic secrets are alcoholism, divorce, and suicide. So we kind of explain that we tend to use drugs and alcohol to cope and escape from our trauma. Oftentimes, some officers don't have the skills to cope or don't have the skills to engage in self-care, so they fall into this pattern of choosing to, seek out remedies and self-care through other means and just kind of this form of escape. With divorce, we often kind of disengage and again become less emotional. And at times you see some officers engage in adultery to escape from the reality, which in turn kind of results in this higher than normal divorce rates. Again, because we internalize our emotions, this kind of results in us really wanting to seek out these permanent solutions to temporary problems. And then tragically, officers end up feeling as if the only option they have left is suicide and is to take their own life. And with the exception of COVID, suicide was the leading cause of death for police officers. And this was over the last several years. And unfortunately, BPD is not immune from any of these secrets. I know even for me personally, I was one of those cops that, bottled my emotion, internalized it, wanted to protect myself, and became kind of a young divorcee. And obviously kind of going through my own experiences and learning from that, and obviously taking this course and kind of recognizing that really kind of helped me develop my interpersonal skills, my social skills, and allowed me to kind of open up and really rely on that social support structure. And then some of you may also know that within the last, I think, 3 or 4 years or so, we've had 2 officers choose to take their life by suicide. Kind of like in a hopeful, optimistic side, BPD is working towards resolving some of these secrets. So we've got a wellness and resilience committee, and we've also just recently revamped our peer support team, which Alex, Officer McDougall, is a member of, and he was voted in by a member of his peers because he's highly respected and trusted to be part of that team. Another thing that we also want to highlight to the officers is that kind of another way to combat a lot of these secrets and to really kind of help officers out in all of this is to really practice procedural justice. So just kind of giving back and just kind of providing this like very kind of altruistic mentality, which will help eventually keep officers healthy and keep them safer. All right, cynicism in the community. So in this slide, we discuss kind of another side of cynicism that often develops and that officers often see, which is the cynicism that impacts our community, and we call it legal cynicism. And legal cynicism is essentially kind of the belief that permeates amongst our communities that the police don't want to help us or keep us safe. And kind of the key point is that that we want to focus on here is that our trust building efforts on high crime, low trust areas, that we really want to focus our efforts in those areas because those are the areas that really need us the most. So this slide, we start to kind of progress into kind of unpacking the cynicism a little bit more. And we discussed with the class how we were trained to see things differently and how our focus on safety kind of affects us and affects how we view things. And then they kind of really go on to shape our perceptions, which we'll also talk about a little bit later. Us versus them. So this kind of ties in with the perception piece of it, but as police officers, we encounter on a daily basis this 3 to 6% of the population that are not law abiding. But because our perceptions are so distorted and they shape our reality, we have this belief that everyone we encounter is up to no good. And because we interact with this 3% all day, every day, that tends to become our real world. That becomes our reality, right? But when the reality is, in the real world, is that 97% of our population is law abiding, while the 3% is not. But for the cops, we think those stats are completely reversed. And this, to me, was the slide when I initially took this course, was like the most eye-opening for me. And it was the most impactful. And in fact, in module 5, we'll actually discuss how implicit bias really shapes what we actually see in the community and what we often miss. And it's not just police officers, it's everyone, which is also is really interesting. So Sir Robert Peel, so as many may know, he was the father of modern policing. He established the first modern police force, the Metropolitan Police Force in London in 1829. He also developed the first ethics code for police officers, and one of his principles, one of his 9 principles, is paraphrased on this slide. But the most important of which I want to draw your attention to is the very last sentence, which states that the police are the public and the public are the police, which really means that we as police officers are a reflection of the community. And we are entrusted to protect the safety of all of its members. And to me, this principle kind of also stresses the importance that public safety is a collaborative effort that really requires all of us to contribute and engage. The golden rule. Many of us know this rule growing up as kids. Essentially what, and this is what many of us were taught, is that just treating others the way that you want to be treated. And this rule kind of really guides us on how we can build trust with our community. We often tell the officers to ask themselves when we go over this slide is, and even when they're interacting with the public or they're responding to a call, we'll say that, get in the habit of saying, how would I like to be treated in this situation? Or how would I like my mom or my sister or my brother to be treated in this situation? That's kind of always a good guideline for any situation that we try to remind our officers to use. But with procedural justice, we like to take this a step further by really kind of adhering to the platinum rule. So unlike the golden rule, the platinum rule really requires listening and awareness of differences. So in order to kind of truly understand how others want to be treated, we have to listen to them first. So obviously the main difference between the golden rule and the platinum rule is empathy. It's really just kind of taking the time to be in that person's shoes. And procedural justice research has shown that most people across all racial and ethnic groups want the same thing. And it's all that we want to be heard and we want to be understood. And I really love Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And to kind of paraphrase from his book is that we must seek first to understand in order to be understood, which is something that I often like to kind of remind myself in situations. And this will take us to the next slide here. So this is another expectations group exercise. And then in this segment, we break the class into 2 different groups and we ask them to answer these 2 questions separately. So one group has the community expectations while the other has the police officers' expectations. You just give them a few minutes or so, and it's interesting to see what the results are when we return. So this is generally what the community group expects. And this is generally what the police officers expect. And what we typically find in this exercise is that in a lot of ways, the police and the community expect the same things and want the same outcomes. And so what we try to emphasize with the officers is that, and try to illustrate, is that many of these expectations from both sides, from both the police and the community, are really in the service of fighting crime and ensuring public safety. Everyone wants to feel safe. Everyone wants to feel safe walking in their homes and to be treated with respect. But often, as we kind of explained to the classes, is that often these expectations are fraught with and complicated by this lack of trust and this inability to really kind of come together and really want to work together. Can the police fight crime without the community? Short answer is no. And all this kind of leads us to the fact that the foundation, again, to effective policing is through the practice and adherence to procedural justice, which in turn provides us the legitimacy that we need. So again, we try to really kind of focus in on this a lot in this course, is that we need the community to help us solve and prevent crime. And we build a relationship with the community through legitimacy. And we build and increase our legitimacy by practicing procedural justice. And again, it ends up being kind of a repeated kind of pattern that we want to really kind of stress the importance of in this class. All right, so now we move to deterrence theory, which is essentially kind of the belief that people obey the law because they fear the consequences. So deterrence theory says that people really kind of shape their behaviors in response to incentives and penalties. And deterrence can often be expensive with court and incarceration costs. This often is kind of what deters people from committing crimes. Although deterrence to be effective, kind of what they've found is that the state must follow through with the penalties and consequences, kind of this kind of obviously the laws and things of that nature. And in addition to that, people also obey the law because it is the right thing to do, and they believe that the police have the right to tell them what to do. And again, that belief really stems from the public's trust and their kind of legitimacy that they provide to us. And as the bottom of the slide will indicate here, for the most part, everybody and most people, and again, going back to that 97%, people want to do the right thing. Legitimacy. So again, this slide reemphasizes what we discussed in the next module, and that legitimacy is gained by practicing procedural justice, which again is founded on these 4 principles: voice, neutrality, respect, and trust. And again, this is kind of another important distinction that we want to make, is that legitimacy is the public's view and not the officer's view. So that's kind of an important distinction that we try to make with the officers is you're not legitimate because you think you're legitimate and you were given this badge and this gun and you're automatically given this authority. No, it comes from the public's view. It comes from the public entrusting us with that responsibility. And they entrust us with this higher level of moral authority, which again is based on the premise that the public has trust and confidence in us, in the police. And then we try to go into the fact that with this trust comes the acceptance of moral authority, of police authority, and a belief that police actions are morally correct and we're doing the appropriate right thing. We also stress that the legitimacy is critical for us, and it's critical in developing, and it's critical to the police and really kind of develop through this community collaboration and the positive relationships that we make. And procedural justice is the roadmap on how we get to those community collaborations and obviously the legitimacy. So this is the last video of this module. In this video, I'm not going to play it for you. I think it's almost 10 minutes long, but this video depicts a Baltimore police officer. He's responding to kind of a group of juveniles skateboarding in a public plaza, and this officer was a complete and utter jerk. He's like a complete disgrace to the badge. He eventually berates the juvenile, doesn't give him voice, doesn't listen, and at one point slams him to the ground. And after this video was posted to YouTube, the officer was promptly suspended and fired, with the firing being upheld. And kind of what this video tends to highlight is just an example of what not to do and how not to act. And frankly, when I watch this video, it's like, as the saying goes, nobody hates bad cops more than the good ones. And this video, every time I watch it, it makes me cringe. But obviously, I'm relieved and was relieved to know after watching this video that this officer is no longer serving in our profession. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Alex.
Thanks, Ronnie.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next module, I guess I get my screen share set up. just to kind of give you guys a little explanation of why we're doing it this way. When we've taught this class, we usually try to have 3 instructors. And we have a couple of other people in the department who have been in the instructor course. We usually try to have 3 when we do it in large groups. And there it is a lot more interactive, but we usually still have sort of 1 instructor who's kind of the lead presenter for each module. And then the other instructors chime in. There's a lot more discussion when we have the time to do it for a whole group. But in the interest of time tonight, we're kind of just breezing through it and each of us taking the lead on the different modules. So this is module 3, and this is where it kind of gets into the deepest dive on procedural justice itself, following on the previous modules, which is kind of like, why is this important? Where is this going to get us? Why are we doing this? Now it's like the real sort of nuts and bolts. So it starts with sort of leading you into the definition. Justice is obviously what we provide as police officers. It's the justice system that we work within. And procedural justice is the procedures that we use when we're going about our job. I was going to try. So I guess I was going to sort of try this idea. We were sort of experimenting of how well it would work to sort of show the videos and give you the flavor. I actually want you guys to not be able to hear this. So can Mr. Chang or somebody advise you cannot hear this?
Yeah, the volume is off.
Great. And that allows me to just kind of narrate and sort of explain what the video is showing, and you get a little flavor. But again, for timing, we probably can't show you every video in this course. Basically, this video, I guess they pulled it off the internet, and it's these 2 guys who are activists for sort of a religious themed cause. And they're taking a project of walking across the country. And while they're kind of walking through, it seems like mainly the South, they get the cops called on them a lot, or these cops just end up talking to them. I think it's one of the better videos in this class because it really does, to me, it lays out the principles we're talking about, that all of these cops, and they kind of cut between different interactions in these different cities, basically don't adhere to the principles of procedural justice. They don't show neutral motives. They don't show trustworthiness. They cut the guys off. And I'm wondering, in the end, so this is them. They kind of do these little protest actions in each of their stops. And this is the last cop. This is the good cop who comes out, displays the components of procedural justice, has a little conversation, a couple of chuckles with these guys. They appreciate it, and everybody just goes about their business. And so that's a good lead into this, which, and I always bring it out in the class, essentially when you look at the interactions that these guys had with all these different officers, the outcome in all of the interactions ends up being the same. Because if you're able to watch the whole thing, even the cops that are, doing a bad job, if in the end, let the guys go. These guys kind of stand their ground and they say, you can't, I don't have to give you my ID. We're allowed to be doing this. We're not doing it illegal. We're just walking on the side of the road. And the cops always eventually back down. And so the outcome is the same in every stop, including the last stop where the officer just comes out and kind of chats with them and goes on his way. Their assessment of all the context is obviously very different because they only think that the one cop was doing his job properly. And so what's the difference? As this slide highlights with the big gold star, it's the process. It's how the officers conducted the contact and how they treated these guys that makes the difference to their assessment. So procedural justice is essentially that principle. It's the procedures, it's how officers go about their business that influences if the community members or the public is going to think that that's legitimate. And as it says in the bottom of this slide, the outcome of a police contact mostly does not really have an effect on if people perceive it's legitimate. It's how the officers conducted it and how they treated the people involved that influences people's views. This is sort of a video that shows the opposite side of that coin, I guess. So it's a little news segment from down in Southern California. And it's a profile of this guy. His name's Elton Simmons. He's a sheriff's deputy with LA County. And he actually does traffic enforcement, which is essentially writing tickets all day, every day. And what they found out, I imagine the sheriff's office sort of put this out as a public relations campaign or part of it, because they realized that this guy, he's been on like 20 years in traffic most of the time, and he's never had a complaint. And I guess the way they present it, that doesn't mean he's never had a sustained complaint. He's literally never gotten anybody to come in and complain about him. And this is his captain kind of showing how they realized that. And so the reporter ends up sitting down with him and kind of talking to him about it. And when he talks to him, I mean, Simmons is a really self-effacing guy. And they ask him, you know, well, why do you think you don't get any complaints? And he's like, I don't know. I mean, this is just kind of how I do it. But the way he describes it and lays it out, it becomes clear. And they actually follow him around and watch a couple of his traffic stops. It becomes clear that he's doing this procedural justice, not because he went to some class. It's just his personality. But it shows him treating people this way. And again, it ends up being just a really good, vivid illustration of how this guy doing things that almost anybody would say. People hate getting tickets. Traffic cops are like the meanest cops. If you're going to get complaints anywhere, it's going to be as a traffic motor officer. And here's a guy who can do it. And because of the way he does it, literally every single person, I mean, the no complaints thing, ends up thinking, even if I'm not happy that I got a ticket, it's legitimate. It was fair that I got a ticket from that guy. So why do we know that's the case? Or, you know, where does this come from? Well, it comes from the research of a guy named Tom Tyler, who I think when this course was made, he was at Yale, and he might have moved on since then. He's an academic. I want to say maybe a psychologist. At the time he did this study, I think he was at UCLA, but this study was done in the 80s. I think there's a date on it somewhere. Okay, well, I know I read a few papers about this, and I think the original research was done earlier than this. But they did this street stop study, and basically they did a big survey of a lot of people. It ended up being 1,600 some odd in the sample. They only included people who'd had a recent interaction with police officers. They did it in Oakland and Los Angeles. And they basically just asked the people some questions about how the contact went, and then also how the people felt about it. And the results are kind of on the next few slides. And basically what Tyler found was first that these, in kind of figuring out, well, what influences how people feel about a police contact. And he's done some other research that broadens it to sort of government or criminal justice context generally. So he did some civil court stuff and some probate court, researching probate court actions and decisions. But at this time it was just for police stops. And this chart shows that whether or not, you know, the officers seem to be making a neutral decision or showing trustworthy motives, those things matter in the first two bars, but it's totally eclipsed by how the person was treated, as shown by this, the larger bar there. And then the next part of his data is showing this, that basically, if you imagine two use cases, let's say it's a traffic stop, and you're either going to get a bad outcome getting the ticket, or you're going to get a good outcome getting the warning. And when they looked at this data, they realized people who get a good outcome, as we can see, if you get a good outcome and the officer was fair and nice to you, most people, 87%, are going to feel pretty satisfied with that. Think, okay, that was okay. What's interesting is that here's 13% of people who didn't get a ticket. They still got a warning. But when they looked at it and said, I got a warning, but the officer was a jerk, 13% of people still feel like I wasn't happy with that. That's not legitimate. I don't like the way that went. And then obviously on the other side, you can see that the main one I think is the kind of obvious one. If you get the ticket and the cop's a jerk, almost nobody is going to feel like that is legitimate law enforcement. But what's interesting here is that even if you give people the ticket, but they feel like they're treated fairly, apparently basically 3/4 of them will think, hey, that's a legitimate action. They're not going to complain against you. They'll probably pay the ticket because they're like, hey, I did it. And, you know, the cop was fair. He had a good point, and I kind of deserve that ticket that time. And so basically the way that this came out was when Tom Tyler kind of analyzed this, he broke it down into these 4 components, which is what we teach through the class. And we kind of reinforce this acronym, VNRT. Procedural justice is these 4 things. On one side, it's the quality of the decision-making. So did the officers give the person voice, allow the person to express themselves? And did the officers seem to be coming from a neutral place, right? They're not on the one party or another. You know, if it's somebody calling and saying that guy hit me, the officers don't come and show favoritism. They show neutrality, and they show that overall the process is fair. And then the other sort of component of procedural justice is that the officer shows respect for the people and their rights, makes it clear, that they're not showing personal anger, they're not belittling people, and this trustworthiness that the officers show that they're making their decision, that they're acting from trustworthy motives, so that the officer makes it clear, my motive here is public safety, for example, or my motive is protecting vulnerable people, and not, hopefully not having a motive of something else, but also, not displaying it and making sure to communicate that you do have those trustworthy motives. So then through the rest of this module, it's kind of just breaking down each of these components. So there's some description here about the voice component. Some of the things I draw out here is that, you're always kind of, as an instructor, and the other thing I teach is first aid, like I said, and that's another thing that I think we're getting some more acceptance of it nowadays. Unfortunately, active shooters are a thing now. Officers are realizing, hey, we have to go to these mass casualty events. But especially when I started, first aid was something that maybe cops tended to think like, that's not our job. You got a fire department for that. Why are we learning this? And so I've always looked for ways to kind of look for the resistance a little bit and find ways around it. And this to me is a really good point for those people that you might have in a class that are a little resistant to tell this, because people, the criticism from an officer would be like, well, look, if I have somebody that's like saying dumb stuff and I have to give them voice and I have to let whatever they're saying that doesn't make any sense, or that's really unfair themselves influence the process. Like, actually, you don't, because what Tyler's research showed was that the important part of it is not that you actually take their input into consideration. I mean, if they're saying if they're saying reasonable things, I think we have our training and we do want to take people's input into consideration, but that's not actually what's going to influence how they feel about it. Just letting somebody talk and letting them have their say is going to have a big impact on how they feel about the process. Another criticism that I think they anticipated when they were designing the course, and that is common, is people will say, well, officer safety, if you're letting people start to rant and rave, for example, if they're talking and they're kind of taking over the conversation, well, are you going to sacrifice officer safety? So here's a slide that kind of addresses that. And again, it leads to a discussion that there are ways to let people have their voice, to maintain your nonverbal communication, and maintain, control of a situation without having to be domineering or without having to cut somebody off, and let them have their voice, but still maintain your officer safety. This we've had in a lot of classes, I think, in police training in my time, and sort of just reiterates that it really isn't just about what you say, and so you have to be careful that your nonverbals and your body language is matching the message that you actually want to convey, that you're listening to people and what they're saying is important, and you're going to make a decision based on that and not based on those other things. So then they kind of do the part about neutrality, kind of like I've already discussed, that your decision is not on personal bias, applied equally to all people as it should be under the law. This is a break where they have this exercise, which they call the labeling exercise. And pretty briefly, you just kind of send the groups out, and sometimes we'll do one word, sometimes people will just naturally come up with more than one word. But first we send the participants in the class sort of out in groups and say, write a word or some words that the police use to describe the people in areas that they work. And commonly we see they come back, with like words like knucklehead or turds, or I know one that I read a memoir of an NYPD cop, and I guess skells is the sort of term out there. But this is just a chance to sort of draw out, hopefully, those things that officers will use that, maybe they shouldn't or they don't, but it just creeps into work, and starting to draw out, which is where the slides are going, that there's some damaging effects of that. And we also do the other side, which is what are words that residents use to describe the police? And hopefully you solicit things like, pigs or fascists or these different things to show that this can happen on both sides, and we need to be kind of aware of it and careful for that reason. And so then there's this video, which really does illustrate the negative and the damaging effects of that. people may recognize this guy. He was, I guess, a captain at the sheriff's office, which is in Louisiana at the time. His name's Clay Higgins. He ended up getting elected to Congress from that area, I think. But so this video, I guess, was they were having a problem with this particular criminal gang. And they were doing this sort of public service announcement to basically say, you know, hey, we've had this rash of whatever it was, illegal conduct, if it was shootings or robberies or whatever. And these are guys that we know are associated with this gang. We have warrants for them. And we're telling, you know, kind of putting the community on notice that we're going to keep everybody safe. At least that's the message they want to present. And as you can see in the middle, they switch from all the law enforcement officers wearing their uniform, their dress uniforms in the first part of it, to wearing tactical gear. And he's presenting this kind of very bellicose message. In the back of the other gentlemen in the video who are still in suits, I guess they're community leaders, religious leaders, who they've brought in and who've agreed to be in this video to sort of show solidarity and show, you know, hey, our entire community is standing up against this criminal element. However, when you actually listen to what he says, he ends up using a bunch of labels for these guys in this gang. So he says, you know, we're not going to let these animals push us around. He just uses a lot of words like that. That when you watch the whole thing, the effect is really all the things that you realize about labeling. You know, it's kind of dehumanizing these guys, and you realize it's really driving a wedge where these guys, maybe they're involved in criminal activity, but they're still part of the community. And he's really kind of painting this bright line in a way that it kind of, you're taken aback when you watch the video. And then they bring out this point. I know Ronnie sort of mentioned the little bit of a tie-in to this curriculum. That basically brings out the point that, as the little graph here shows, what you do and how you refer to things can actually influence like what you're going to see in the future. It can influence how people behave back towards you. If you are in the habit of labeling people and, you know, using words or phrases to describe them, that may really influence the behavior you get back from them and kind of create an escalating spiral. There's really good reasons to avoid that. They continue with the other aspects of procedural justice, so respect. And this is usually, in my experience, the one that's easiest for officers to kind of understand and identify with. And then lastly, the trustworthiness, which again is kind of showing trustworthy motives. It says in the bottom, you know, that you're conveying to people that you're trying to do what is the best for them and their best interest. And that's your motive behind whatever you're doing as a law enforcement officer. And then they usually have suggest to bring out some kind of story that's not law enforcement related, because it can be hard for officers. You know, they're sort of very enmeshed in the way they've always done things or the way that they were trained, or and to bring out this example, for example, of like going to a doctor. And this is a common experience. I think many people feel like sometimes you go to the doctor and the doctor doesn't really pay attention to your symptoms, or, you know, just isn't really listening. And this is a way to kind of draw out and give an example that maybe people can identify with, even if they can't quite identify with the law enforcement example. And then this kind of just connects back to some of the themes from Module 2, that really there's two ways to kind of have power. And one way that was maybe kind of common in some law enforcement training circles was the power of control, right? Which is, you know, we are legally allowed to use force and you have to control situations all the time. And so like, that's kind of the main way to do it, is you gotta keep people under control. But this is really making the argument that there is a different and in many ways a better way to have power over people, which is influence, right? Using ethical principles. And if you apply procedural justice, you're much more likely to have people think that you're legitimate, to go along with your actions, and to get where you want, again, without having to use force or threats. You know, hey, I'm going to lock you up if you don't this or whatever. And that is the end of Module 3.
Very cool. All right, we'll take you into Module 4. Module 4. we're almost to the end. So we got 2 more modules left. So hopefully you guys are all bearing with us here. And you guys can see this screen okay?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, cool. All right, module 4. Usually for this module, we usually kind of dim the lights because a lot of the images that we display, the stories that we talk about in this particular module are very like emotionally impactful. And this module specifically kind of examines the historical impacts that policing has had on some communities, and we really dive into understanding why the relationships in those communities are strained, and then how often the police were used or have been used and frankly are still used as tools of kind of these corrupt governments to implement unjust laws within the US. And I know for me, speaking personally, during my initial participation in this course, this for me was like one of the most emotionally powerful and eye-opening modules, because a lot of these images, pictures, stories, I had no idea and was really never provided any historical background or was taught, and specifically really understood how police were used to unfairly kind of target certain communities and cultural groups, and how the impact of those practices really still reverberate today, and really kind of provide this like invisible barrier to connection and trust between the two groups. All right, so over the next several slides, I'll kind of walk you guys through the historical impacts of policing and its effects on our legitimacy with certain communities. In this module, we'll also kind of understand, and we'll explain to the officers that even today, officers are kind of the products of that history, and that history that we're going to discuss is really uncomfortable to talk about, but we need to talk about it. It's uncomfortable, it's emotional, but it's something that needs to be addressed. And it's part of that kind of repair trust building process that we need to start. And kind of one of the first steps in building this trust and legitimacy is to really understand and acknowledge how the police were used unfairly to treat people of color, and why those sentiments are really still felt today. I know, as Alex mentioned previously, kind of in another version of this training, when we had the opportunity to kind of modify some of the slides, we actually discussed how Berkeley was not necessarily isolated from a lot of these discriminatory practices. And in fact, we included in the PowerPoint that our city participated in redlining. I know Berkeley side did a pretty good feature on that piece. And as we know, redlining was segregated our communities. And then we also discussed kind of the city's involvement in the internment of the Japanese during World War II. How did we get here? So with this, we discussed that being a law enforcement officer is an honorable, noble profession. It's kind of generally why we got into this profession, is to help people. But what we kind of want to take officers back to is the time that when our profession was not used for this kind of noble means, and that we were used in very dishonorable ways. And again, kind of reiterate to the officers is that this history is not easy to see, but it's important for us to recognize that this history really influences how certain communities perceive us, and particularly those communities with low levels of trust for us, and kind of how they view us. And again, there are these barriers to trust building. So all 4 of these photos depict the abuses by law enforcement during the civil rights movement. The top left, as you'll see, an officer is seen kind of ripping away an American flag from the hands of a child. And kind of in a nod to irony here, there's an officer in the background that is seen holding a ripped up sign that reads "No more police brutality." I don't know if you guys can see that. And in the top right, a high school student is arrested in Atlanta, Georgia in 1963. Bottom right photo, it's a man crouching on the ground. He's trying to escape. As you can see, the repeated baton strikes of the state police during the Freedom Summer protests of 1964. The bottom left is a rather iconic photo. This is of a 17-year-old demonstrator in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And he's being attacked by police dogs during a civil rights protest. And again, kind of all these images and messages are what we're hearing today. we're often seeing the signs again, no more police brutality and things of that nature. And this is really why it's important for all of us to understand our history. So we kind of take the officers back from the very beginning, and we go all the way back to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And this act, as we explained, was enacted in 1850 and allowed a person to be hunted down by law enforcement because of the color of their skin, and is an example of a person being treated as a piece of property, essentially, simply just based on the color of their skin. The convict lease program, again, this was another example of the criminal justice failures in which it allowed a person of color to be treated as property. States would often kind of lease prisoner labor to private properties such as plantations and companies. And because of the discriminatory law enforcement practices in the South, most of the convicts were African American. And often these programs existed, predominantly through the South and immediately after the Civil War. And many of these convicts really never returned or had the opportunity to return to freedom. And in effect, these lease programs operated essentially as a legal form of slavery. As most of you might all be aware, based on the expansive reporting recently by the New York Times, the Tulsa race riots of 1921 was one of the worst race riots in U.S. history. At the time, Tulsa had a segregated but economically and financially thriving community of Greenwood. The riots reportedly kind of stemmed over a fabricated story of a Black man who assaulted a white woman in an elevator. And this kind of inflamed the existing racial tensions within the two communities, which resulted in this riot. And the riot consisted of a mob of about hundreds of white residents that attacked this Black community of Greenwood. They estimated that about 300 or so, mostly Black African Americans, were killed, and another estimated 10,000 people were left homeless, with most of their businesses, homes, and schools burned and destroyed. And in 2001, a state-appointed commission found that the city of Tulsa conspired with the mob to withhold aid to the residents of Greenwood, which obviously prevented and limited their ability to recover. And obviously they lost that kind of generational wealth. And in 2013, then, as you'll see the picture on the right, then Tulsa Police Chief Chuck Jordan issued an apology for his police department's inactions during those riots. And again, as most of us are additionally aware, this community is continuing to uncover the mass grave sites from this horrific tragedy some 100 years later. The script on the left was taken from a city council meeting in California. And again, as you can see, it kind of further reinforced racial segregation. And again, this was in California a little under 100 years ago. The photo on the right is from a hotel door in Stockton, California from 1930. And if you can see what the image says, it says positively, no Filipinos allowed. Again, Jim Crow laws, all these signs are filled with labels, which were meant to dehumanize a person based on the color of their skin. We talked again a little bit about the labeling and dehumanizing aspect of labeling. And as you kind of notice in one of the signs, that human beings are listed next to an animal. As this sign depicts, the Jim Crow laws were based on race, and these laws were enforced by law enforcement. And some people that kind of grew up under these laws are still alive today. And many of that kind of anger and distrust that we see is because of a system that law enforcement that we helped perpetuate, and was a system that consistently and systematically discriminated against people of color. Picture on the left is of Mr. Reuben Stacy, who was lynched in Oklahoma in 1935. And he was lynched and kidnapped with police assistance and encouragement. Michael McDonald is another recent example of this killing continuing. Mr. McDonald was kidnapped in 1981 and murdered by 2 KKK members in Mobile, Alabama. His mother later brought a wrongful death lawsuit against the KKK and was awarded $7 million, which subsequently bankrupted the organization. Again, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but the internment of the Japanese during World War II was the forced relocation of over 100,000 people of Japanese ancestry. This was based on an order by then President Franklin D. Roosevelt under an executive order that was carried out by the military and local law enforcement. Some records have revealed that, again, as we discussed in a previous kind of abbreviated version of this course, that Berkeley did participate in this program. And then our very own, as some of you may know, Officer Ronald Tsukamoto, who our public safety building is named after, and who was one of the first Japanese American police officers for BPD, was in fact born in an internment camp in Tule Lake, California. The Zoot Suit riots. These were a series of racial attacks against Mexican Americans, specifically Mexican American youth by U.S. servicemen in LA in 1943. There was kind of this existing racial hostility between Mexican Americans, and then there was some existing inflammatory media propaganda that kind of really drove the fears of delinquency and lawlessness among Mexican Americans during World War II. The flashy suits that the Zoot Suits kind of presented and that were worn by these Mexican American men were often kind of seen as unpatriotic. And this was largely because of the wartime rations. And so those rations coupled with the flashiness of the suits really kind of made Mexican Americans easy targets for these servicemen. And so many of these servicemen, or excuse me, many of the Mexican Americans were attacked brutally so by these U.S. servicemen, and largely while LAPD just stood by and did nothing. And then the LA mayor later claimed a few weeks later that racial prejudice was not a factor in any of these attacks. I think many of us are well aware of Miss Rosa Parks and her refusal to give up a seat on the bus to a white passenger in 1955. Again, her action and arrest later sparked, as we know, the Montgomery bus boycott. A key point that we emphasize is that this arrest was that she was arrested by law enforcement. And again, that kind of paints another example of police officers being used to enforce laws that discriminate based on the color of someone's skin. And again, it's like this history that has created and has been created that kind of breeds this mistrust of law enforcement. Emmett Till. Emmett was a 14-year-old from Chicago. So he was visiting family in Mississippi when he was lynched for allegedly flirting with a white woman. He was kidnapped from his relative's home by the woman's husband and father. Emmett was beaten and mutilated before he was shot. His body was later dumped into the local river and was weighed down by a cotton fan blade. His murderers, as we know, were later acquitted by an all-white jury after 67 minutes of deliberation. One juror later commented to a newspaper media that if we hadn't stopped to drink pop, it wouldn't have taken that long. And protected, unfortunately, by double jeopardy, the murderers later admitted to the killings in a magazine interview. The picture on the left is of 4 Black police officers who graduated from Fort Worth Police Academy in 1953. The picture on the right is of the Greensboro 4, who in 1960 were refused service at the Woolworth's whites only lunch counter because of the color of their skin. What's really kind of impactful and interesting about the men on the left is that they were given the authority to serve and protect the community, but it took them another 7 years before they could sit at a counter with a white person. Operation Wetback. This was a law enforcement initiative that was created in 1954 to deal with the illegal entry of Mexican citizens into the U.S. Law enforcement, again, was used to locate, process, and deport undocumented Mexicans. These tactics that they used were often brutal, and many Mexicans were subjected to civil rights violations before being deported. And again, kind of tragically, this initiative and tactics are very reminiscent of the current issues currently at the U.S.-Mexico border. And as we can kind of recall from a lot of the media images, the recent images of the Border Patrol attempting to round up the Haitian immigrants along the Rio Grande is kind of very reminiscent of this operation. So the 2 images on the left and the right are of the Little Rock 9. which were 9 Black students who were enrolled in Little Rock's previously was all-white Central High School. In September 1975, then Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus, he deployed the Arkansas National Guard to the high school to support the segregationists in barring the Little Rock Nine from entering the school. The students were not allowed to enter until President Eisenhower intervened, and he deployed the U.S. Army 101st Airborne Division to escort and safely kind of protect the students as they made entry. The photo on the left is of Governor Faubus with the image of a Confederate flag, as you see in the background. And to many, and we remind again the officers in the class, is that this flag is often used as a symbol of hate and violence in the segregated South. It can be very triggering for some people. And in the photo on the top right is of Elizabeth Eckford, who is one of the Little Rock Nine. And you can see that she's being pursued by a mob of women as she tries to enter the school. And you kind of see the anger and the kind of the vitriol being shouted her way as she kind of stoically marches on. And then the photo on the bottom is a former New Jersey SWAT lieutenant. So he adorned this Confederate hat during a goodwill trip to Louisiana during Hurricane Katrina. And what we want to kind of capture with all these images is that all these images of the civil rights movement that took place in the 60s, the actions of law enforcement today can easily trigger these memories of how law enforcement has been used to enforce racist laws, or was complicit in perpetuating a lot of this racial hostility. So this is an infamous image of Alabama Governor George Wallace, who in 1963, in June 1963, blocked the entrance of 2 Black students into the University of Alabama. Wallace himself stood in the doorway of the auditorium, which was known at the time as the stand in the schoolhouse door. And as some know, Governor Wallace was known for his infamous inauguration speech in 1963, in which he said, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." And as you can also notice, that Governor Wallace is flanked by several law enforcement officers. And again, they're kind of being used to enforce these discriminatory laws. So many people believe that law enforcement is infected with racist white officers. In these images, obviously the images like these on the bottom and the far right tend to perpetuate and illustrate these beliefs. The photo on the bottom center is again of the same New Jersey SWAT lieutenant pretending to be a KKK member. And then the photo on the right is an officer posing in his Klan robes. This officer is from an agency in Florida. He was later outed, identified, and justifiably fired. So the image on the left was taken from a Klan rally, while the image on the right was taken during the Freddie Gray protest in Baltimore. What we emphasize and reiterate to the officers is that these images are really kind of reminders that these children are the 97% of the community that we serve, and the need for us to kind of battle with our own cynicisms so that we can serve these members with trust. The Stonewall riots. So these riots were started after New York PD raided the Stonewall Inn, which was a nightclub that catered to the LGBTQ community in 1969. This raid sparked demonstrations which kind of protested the treatment of the gay community. And at the time, these protests were seen by many as kind of the single most, and even now, the single most important event that led to the modern LGBTQ movement in the US. And in 2016, President Obama declared the Stonewall Inn a national monument to the LGBTQ movement. Kind of now move into actions and perceptions, which we also kind of previously discussed in previous modules. But the image on the left is a group of white officers beating a Black man during a civil rights protest. The image on the right is of a Stockton police officer using lawful and legitimate force. At the time that Stockton photo was taken, the media thought it was just another form of police brutality, largely because our history and the perceptions of force still affects people today. However, what the media did not see was a suspect trying to get the officer's gun. And this cell phone footage was captured a little bit later and distributed a little bit later and showed what happened prior to the officer's justifiable use of the baton strikes. So many of you may know this image. This image should be, I think, recognizable by everyone as the Rodney King beating. So in 1991, Rodney King was beaten by a group of LAPD officers following a lengthy high-speed chase. This video was captured by a witness who happened to be standing on his balcony and testing his new video camera. And he ultimately captured the footage, which was later aired all around the world. And what we like to kind of tell the officers in this image is that, although we are all better trained, and specifically here at Berkeley PD, we consider ourselves one of the best trained. There are still law enforcement agencies across the country that violate trust by abuse or killing. And obviously something that we tragically witnessed recently with the death of George Floyd. Abner Louema, this was in 1997. So Mr. Louema was a Haitian immigrant who was beaten and forcibly sodomized with a broomstick by NYPD officers after he was arrested outside of a Brooklyn nightclub. The officers were later convicted in federal court, and this again was yet another example of police abuses against a person of color. The Rampart scandal. So Rampart was a division within the LAPD, and this scandal involved officers from a prestigious anti-gang, anti-crime unit in the late 1990s. Ultimately, over 70 officers were later implicated in some form of misconduct, and the misconduct ranged anywhere from shootings, beatings, planning of false evidence, perjury, stealing and dealing drugs, in addition to bank robbery. And to this day, even in comparison to the local OPD Riders case, this Rampart scandal specifically is the most widespread case of police corruption in U.S. history. So this picture was taken in 2015 from the North Miami Police Department, in which they were found to be using mug shots of Black men for sniper practice at a gun range. And again, these images affects people's trust of the police, and these images portray and perpetuate that image that African-American men are to be hunted or are less than human or less deserving of respect and dignity. We should all know these two men, so Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King Jr., two of the most important men of the civil rights movement. Mr. Evers was a civil rights activist, as we know, from Mississippi. He was assassinated by a KKK member in 1963. His trials, both trials actually ended with hung juries, and his murder was not convicted until 1994. Mr. Evers is famous for saying you can kill a man, but you can't kill an idea. And Martin Luther King Jr., as we all know, was assassinated in 1968 while he was in Tennessee to support sanitation workers who were on strike. And again, one of his most famous quotes, among many quotes that he had, is depicted here. If I cannot do great things, I can do small things in a great way. And as kind of we'll discuss a little bit later with officers, is that even the smallest of things or the shortest of encounters with a community can have large, long-lasting impacts. So this quote was taken from Officer Montrell Jackson's Facebook page. And this was a few days after 4 Dallas police officers were ambushed at a Black Lives Matter protest. A few days later, Officer Jackson tragically was ambushed and killed while responding to a domestic violence incident. And this message that Officer Jackson is a great one. It's a very kind of heartfelt, emotional post that he has. And it's profound, and it's a message that we like to have our officers kind of carry with them throughout their day. So all these images are men that were killed and trying to protect people's rights. And again, the message of this slide that we again emphasize and want to reiterate to the officers is that, it cannot be about an us versus them. And we remind our officers that we must, and it's absolutely critical for all of us to work together and really emphasize that public safety, again, is this kind of collaborative effort that requires all of our contributions. And this kind of takes us to the community bank account. And this is kind of why that everything a police officer does is either a deposit or a withdrawal in the community bank account. And as kind of Elton Simmons does on a daily basis, is he's constantly making those deposits in this community bank account with his practice and his consistent practice of procedural justice. And a deposit essentially is a positive encounter with the community, while a withdrawal is a negative one. And again, every interaction is an opportunity for us to make a deposit into this fast community bank account. And then lastly, in the end, we let the officers know that deposits will increase our legitimacy, and procedural justice is a deposit. And sometimes the withdrawals are part of human nature, but kind of as we'll discuss in module 5, oftentimes our implicit bias can contribute to these withdrawals. So for us, it's kind of important to recognize that it takes 10 deposits to make up for one withdrawal. And how we kind of increase our deposits is through procedural justice, and treating people fairly and with respect is a deposit that will help build that community bank account. And deposits like procedural justice will make all of us safer and ultimately increase voluntary compliance. With that, we're on to module 5. We're making pretty good time here.
There we go. All right. I appreciate you guys staying with us. This is the last module, but it's one of the longest ones in the actual class. It's like 2 hours, a little over 2 hours. So we're going to go very quickly through it, and hopefully you guys can bear with me for just a little while longer. So this module, when Ronnie and I took this instructor class, was actually taught by the woman who created this material, who's Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt. She's an academic at Stanford. And so these sides, you can see they're tagged with this Stanford Spark. And I don't remember what Spark stands for, but that's her center, her lab at Stanford that did some of this work and that she does this program out of. So she's a very good, very dynamic presenter. And I can't do this as well as she does it, but I'm going to do my best to kind of go over it all. And you'll probably hear me through it say, basically referring to her, because a lot of it is her research. This is kind of her life's work. I mean, she was a MacArthur Fellow maybe 8 or 10 years ago. With that said, we'll go in. So it starts, this is the module on implicit bias, and it starts with kind of an introduction that we know the police officers have to be out interacting with the community, but there's this wall that can come between police and community, which is implicit bias. So as with any post-course, there's some objectives. We're going to define implicit bias, talk about the sources of it, where it comes from, some specific examples, particularly that pertain to law enforcement. And then at the end, we're going to discuss some interventions we can use or try to kind of overcome or counteract implicit bias. So asking that question, what is it? They give this definition: thoughts or feelings about people that we're unaware of and can influence our own actions or perceptions. So here she sort of starts with a primer on that and describes, I guess her field is, she's a social psychologist. And so her study is the brain and people's perceptions and all of that. So she starts here and kind of describes the way people perceive just things in general. And this is a slide to say that as we're going through daily life, we're getting stimuli from everywhere. So you're seeing things, you're hearing things, smelling things. It's kind of all this stuff bombarding your brain. And in the end, human brains have evolved to sort of process and categorize this. And what she describes is that when particularly we're kind of always categorizing and labeling things. And as we talk about people, we tend to put labels on people, as we've kind of already talked about. That's sort of a tendency to attach labels to people. So you have all these different labels, but in American society, we end up having a set of stereotypes that are present in the culture labels about people that kind of get categorized. And as she describes, their essentially race is one of the dominant categorizations that is present in American society. And we have these labels that we end up applying to these vast racial groups in ways that really aren't healthy. So then she introduces the concept of inattentional blindness. And doing the class, people may have seen this. I've seen this in a couple of other classes or contexts. But so you play this video, and this was an experiment that some researchers did. These guys, I guess, listed at the bottom. And basically, the students in the class are instructed, hey, there's two teams. There's the team in the white t-shirt and the team in the black t-shirt. And we're going to play the video, and they tell you, focus on the team in the white t-shirt and count the number of passes they make with the basketball. And as it turns out, people who've done this, I guess, in labs, and then also when you do it in class, when you play that, like half the people pretty reliably don't notice that there's another individual in a gorilla suit who walks through the middle of the frame. And so this is an example of inattentional blindness. If you're sort of really focused on counting the passes, maybe you're going to miss like something that most of us would think that's actually pretty obvious. This is where she draws out on this slide that the difference between implicit bias, which again is kind of an unconscious thing that really is sort of tied into the culture and all these ideas you're absorbing from the culture, and explicit bias, which this picture represents explicit bias. This is the really overt explicit racism. And she makes the point that we're not talking about that. We're not here to accuse people of that. We're talking about things that you're probably not even aware of all of the biases you have in modern life. I mean, you may have a bias that I prefer trucks rather than cars. Well, that's one kind of bias. But then she goes on to say that the main bias that she's going to focus on and talk about in this class is the Black crime bias, this bias in American culture to associate Black people with criminality. She asked the question, where does the Black crime association come from? So this is where it gets pretty data heavy. And again, I'm going to have to kind of go quickly, and hopefully it still makes sense. But so she presents this data. This is rates of imprisonment for Black and white Americans over this period of 60 years. And as we can see, Blacks are incarcerated at a much higher rate than white Americans. Again, going back to a lot of the things that Ronnie discussed in the previous module, that's where that comes from. And this is the result. Bringing it down this way, they show, here's the overall US population. And I think this is from 2011 census data, as it shows at the bottom of this slide. Whites are a much higher percentage of the US population at that time compared to Blacks. And the prison population is much different. Blacks are very overrepresented in the prison population. But what she points out here is that when researchers did a survey and asked people, tell us what you think is the percentage of Black and white Americans in prison, the survey came back that people actually thought it was a lot higher than it was, which both shows this bias in action and also can help to perpetuate that bias. And then she describes some of the other ways that bias really is present in our culture. I think we know more about this now than in 2016 of sort of the Facebook effect and the echo chamber effect. That if you're susceptible to certain kinds of stories, social media is going to feed you those kinds of stories and provide that type of content. That news media has a documented bias in providing the types of stories that associate Black people with crime. And I guess this is like a bulletin from a police department showing that these images kind of come up again and can tend to be sort of reinforcing. And then she talks about media depictions. I don't know if this is a movie, I don't recognize it, but the next one, we obviously have Fiddy. I don't remember the name of this movie, but she makes the point that these are very common images in media and end up reinforcing that bias. The quote that she has is it's in the facilitation guide, is in a culture saturated with ideas, images, and statistics like these, the air is thick with the notion that Black people are prone to criminality. When she teaches this, she tells actually a really poignant story. I've heard her speak several times. I think she did a TED Talk too, where she mentioned this. She tells this really poignant story of when she was getting on a plane with one of her children, young son, and she's an African-American woman. And she gets on the plane and they're kind of getting settled, and another African-American man walks onto the plane, and her son, I guess, was probably very young. I would imagine like 3 or 4. I don't exactly remember. But he notices this man, and the first thing he says to her son is, hey, that guy looks like daddy. And as she relates it, she's like, not really, like they're physically very dissimilar in height and build and all these things. And she's kind of like, well, that's a little weird. I don't really think so, but they're both Black. Okay. And then the next thing her son says is, I hope he doesn't rob the plane. And she does a great job communicating it, that again, she probably knows more about this than anyone in America. And yet she's unable to prevent her son from absorbing this idea that is just sort of saturated in the culture, as she describes. So in the next part of this, she goes on to describe sort of on this slide, how does this affect us? We know this bias exists. We know we really can't get away from it. What is it actually doing to us? How does it affect us? And she lays it out in several steps. It affects what we see. So this is where she describes a bunch of research. This research, I believe, was done by Dr. Eberhardt at her center. So they did this study, this face priming study. And the way it worked is study participants would come in and they're sitting in front of a computer. And what they would see is a little flicker of these subliminal images. And hopefully you guys can kind of see that on the slides. There's a slowed down version of it, which it shows that, trying to see if I have to click again. Yeah. It's a flicker that in the middle contains a face, and it's either a Black face or a white face. And then after that subliminal sort of priming, the study participant is shown a degraded image. This is frame 1 of that image, and it's very fuzzy. And then over a number of frames, the image becomes more clear. And by the end, you can see that this image is an image of a gun. And in the study, participants were either shown, like I said, the prime was either a Black face or a white face. And then the image they're shown is either what's called a crime-centric object, which would be a gun or a knife. And I think they have some different examples. Or there are sort of non-crime-centric objects like a penguin or whatever. And in the study, what they looked at was both how quickly people could identify the object. And on the next slide, we'll go to the next slide. So this is the frame rate. And as we can see with crime irrelevant objects, this is the penguin. It kind of doesn't matter if you're primed with a white face or a Black face. It takes people about the same amount of frames of that image sharpening before people can say, okay, I get it, it's penguin. What was the interesting result was for crime relevant objects, this is the gun. Again, if people get no prime, it's about the same as the penguin, what you'd expect. But where people were primed with a Black face, they identify a crime relevant object much, much quicker. Again, showing that we just have this association between Black people and criminality. And she has a slide to show some of the faces that were included in that research. And we see kind of the opposite effect as well. When people are primed with a white face, they're even slower to identify a crime relevant object. They have done this study a number of times. They've done it with different groups of people. Obviously, I think, like with most studies, they start with students who's accessible to an academic. But what they found is that it didn't matter the race of the study participants. So whether they give this experiment to white participants or Black participants, they basically get the same result. And anti-Black prejudice didn't dictate how strongly this result came through, showing that it just applies to anybody. The kind of irrespective of what your personal beliefs are, most Americans, you put them through this, are going to show the same result. She goes on to talk about how implicit bias affects what we do, the actual actions we take. So this is another study which was done by some other academics. But in this study, similar thing, they sit people in front of a computer and they show them these images. And the images have a person superimposed on whatever scene, and the person's holding something. And it's either an innocuous object, in this case, it's like a soda can, like this gentleman also carrying a soda can, or it is a threatening object, a gun. And what participants do in this study is they are sitting there and they have two buttons, a shoot button and a don't shoot button. And the images flash up at whatever speed they've determined. And the participants are supposed to, whenever a new image comes up, as quickly as they can, choose either shoot or don't shoot and hit the appropriate button. And so they just see a succession of images. And when we go through the class, we sort of present this and have the people who are sitting in the classes we're teaching it sort of do that and, clap, hit the table with one hand. Your right hand means shoot, your left hand means don't shoot. And you see all these different images. So the results of this study again show that there is this black crime bias because with reaction times, you see that with a subject with a gun, overall with a gun, the participants are quicker to shoot. The gun is recognizable and they're able to hit that button quickly. Whereas with no gun, the reaction times in any case are longer, probably because people are sort of confirming, well, really, are we sure that's not a threat? But as we see here, if the person depicted on the screen holding the object is black and it's a gun, the study participants shoot even quicker. And if the person on the screen with no gun is black, they actually even have a higher lag, almost as if they're having to really reconfirm, because again, their mind is telling them black people and crime, those go together. Are you sure he doesn't have a gun? And the other side of this study was the error rates. So it shows that even when they're shown a black person on the screen, there tends to be a higher error rate, again, because your brain is kind of just reinforcing black people, crime, and you're more likely to shoot a black person even when they're holding the soda can. And on the other side, it shows kind of the same thing, that even when you have a black person holding a gun, it's that much quicker, which essentially almost to me is there's still an error rate there. You just happen to shoot too quickly, but the person just happened to have a gun, even though you weren't really clicking the shoot button based on what they had in their hand, but really reacting to the person's race. She goes on to say that implicit bias can affect where we actually focus our eyes. So this is a study that's sort of the inverse of the previous study. In this case, they first do the subliminal priming with an object, again, either a crime relevant object, knife or a gun, or an innocuous object. And then the screen shows these two faces, and the computer has a camera that can track where the study participants look. And what they showed from this was that subjects that were primed with a crime relevant object were more likely to look towards the black face when the screen came up. She describes how implicit bias affects how we interpret behavior. So this one, I'll kind of start playing it. This is not itself a scientific study. It's kind of like a news magazine video. But basically they did this experiment. I've seen other versions of this in kind of news programs. They put a bike in the park and they lock it to this pole. And then they have a guy up there basically trying to cut the bike off and wait and see how the passerbys will react. And what they found was when it's a white guy trying to steal the bike, only this one couple stopped to actually do anything about it. And then of course they send a black man in to basically do the exact same concept and see that the people going by in the park react much differently. Many more people talk to them about it. The people react differently. And I think in the end, end up actually getting a cell phone and calling the police. So that's just anecdotal evidence, but again, kind of shows that there is this black crime bias that's implicit in kind of American culture. This was another interesting study on the, if I can get the videos to play. So what they did in this study was they took video of different subjects doing these different actions. The subjects always do the same action or some version of the same action, but you can't actually see anything about them because they're kind of in this silhouette. And they showed these videos to study participants and asked them, hey, just tell us what you think the race of this person that's depicted in the video is. For our sake, and we can, we end up telling people in class after they've watched this, I guess it's the subject on the left of the screen is black and the subject on the right of the screen is white. So the interesting finding here was that if you give people a still frame, so sort of just the beginning of the video as it started, and you say, hey, please judge race from this, as best you can, people don't do a good job. They really cannot accurately determine it. But once you show study participants the moving video, they can actually determine the racial identity of the person in there at a rate higher than chance. When she explains this, I guess it's sort of unclear exactly how that is happening, but it does show, and why it's really relevant to the police officers taking this course, is that in a certain sense, police officers have a part of their training that's like, well, don't focus on who people are, focus on their behavior, what they're doing, how they're moving their hands, look for those furtive gestures. But this is research that shows that even if you are trying to be careful to just focus on behavior, your brain may be subliminally telling you, well, that's the behavior of a Black person. And it turns out, there's kind of maybe something there, and there's some way that your brain is influencing you in that manner, something else to be careful about how implicit bias can present itself. Then she describes how implicit bias actually alters how we interact with other people. And this is based on research that they've studied. They've sent participants in to have an interaction in different situations. And they basically have determined that cross-racial interactions tend to be emotionally and kind of mentally taxing. And the way they do that is they, will recruit study participants. They send them in to talk to somebody. It's either a same race conversation or a cross-racial conversation. And then afterwards, they give them the Stroop test, which is this. And the way this works, it's like it says on the screen, you say the color of the letters. And at the beginning, it's easy because the color matches the actual word that's spelled out, as it showed here. But then as the test goes on, there's a mismatch. And so it's much harder to focus and say the color of the letters instead of actually reading the word that's on the screen. And that can give a measure of somebody's sort of the mental stress that they're under, because they'll make more mistakes and they'll take longer to identify each thing. And what the researchers found was in cross-racial interactions, people show a lot more stress when you give them the Stroop test afterwards. And why that's really important for us is that, particularly in the really volatile interactions, as you have with a police officer making a contact or a detention, they may not recognize that some of the stress that they end up feeling is from this effect, and misinterpret it or not realize that they have to take that into account. She goes on to just sort of describe the effects of stress on the body. And a lot of this kind of goes back to, if it was module 2, I think, that talks about the sort of sources of stress that officers undergo and how that can kind of alter their outlook. And she brings it around to this point where she basically says that the effects of having all that stress can tend to kind of give officers a sort of myopia. So instead of seeing here's a complete sort of picture represented on this slide, of course, but complete picture of a community where you have, people playing, they're riding their bikes, they're raising their kids, getting a haircut, getting married, a doctor treating a patient. But if you are subject to the stress and you're not doing anything about it, officers can tend to focus on, again, on this sort of one very narrow part of this community, and that's all they see. They're missing this entire picture. And not only do you miss, kind of connecting back to the slides that Ronnie had showed earlier, where we sort of have this mismatch of the 3% of the population that we end up getting this feeling of, well, that's actually the 90% of the population. And she also points out that that stress can end up not only making you miss positive images of other people, but it will make you miss the positive images of yourself. Again, connecting back to some of the earlier themes in the class that there's a lot of ways that we end up not really identifying with and working from the values that we would actually say are important to us. This slide repeats echoes back to the law enforcement code of ethics. And again, they have the audio of the code of ethics and shows that graduation scene. And the other thing that she brings out here is that we have to be careful, because even if officers are aware of this bias and are working to counteract it. The bias of others can also come into what we do. So we have a lot of ways to call the police. You know, BART has an app. And those are all ways for, if we're not careful, to have other people's biases influence what we're going to end up doing. And this is the typical kind of situation. In the background, there's the African-American gentleman just kind of, you know, he's got his book bag, he's walking down the path, and somebody's calling the police on him because they are subject to these biases. They're misinterpreting behavior and calling in as a suspicious person. This is a video that kind of illustrates that. One of the updates in the class later was a kind of a cooler version of this, where they actually get, it didn't work. They actually get both videos superimposed, because what happens is this officer gets a call on an African-American gentleman who is just walking through this neighborhood. And so the officer, you know, ostensibly is not responding to his own biases. He didn't just choose to stop this guy, but somebody called on him, even though he really wasn't doing anything that we would say is actually suspicious or actually indicative of criminality. What ends up happening is the subject starts filming the officer on his phone, and the officer, who's kind of lacking some professionalism and decides to be a bit of a jerk, I guess, pulls out his own phone in kind of this smarmy way and films the guy back. And there is a video out here, I think they updated it, where they can put the two videos next to each other. And so you really get that sense of like putting yourself in the other person's shoes, because the two perspectives are right next to each other. Again, that's kind of a good video because it does provide that really vivid example of how other people's biases can kind of combine with maybe the biases the officer have and lead to a very tense encounter. And then of course, this example, you know, the next door effect, this became kind of notorious, especially around that time, for reinforcing a lot of that stuff. So here she brings it back to sort of the beginning of the presentation and how I thought there was an animation to this slide. Maybe it comes up in a minute, but starting to get to how these biases cumulatively affect law enforcement's work in the community, and brings up some of these, you know, really famous examples. The example of Eric Garner, of Tamir Rice, of Walter Scott and Freddie Gray. And then also combining it with the examples that, again, connect back to the module Ronnie taught, showing historical examples and really drawing it out that this implicit bias and all of the history and the things that people build up around that really have a profound impact on the way that law enforcement interacts with the community. And that can lead to people having a very biased take on law enforcement. And in the same way that we've kind of recognized law enforcement can label people unfairly, people will apply these labels to law enforcement, and everybody's missing the legitimate and valuable parts of law enforcement that most cops most of the time are out there helping people and doing their best and want to do a good job. Okay, I guess this is the slide I was thinking of. So she talks about this, you know, we know based on all the preceding material that there's this wall of implicit bias keeping us from having good interactions with the community, and how do we break this wall down, or at least start to? And so she has a section on kind of interventions, which starts off with this quote. And I guess it was funny when I was going back and preparing, you kind of realize that James Comey is a little more of kind of a polarizing figure than maybe in 2016 when he was just the FBI director and when they pulled this quote. But this was a statement that he, I guess, probably wrote or maybe gave in a speech, where he acknowledges the implicit bias and the really detrimental effects it's having, particularly in the relationship and interactions between law enforcement and the Black community. And what he lays out here, which again is going to feed into the rest of the presentation, is one way to try to begin overcoming that is to design systems and processes to fight back against that implicit bias. So how do we address it? This is where we have a table exercise, and we send the class participants out to kind of think about it and sort of prime themselves for the material that's going to come. So we ask them, what can your department do to think on these questions? What can you personally as an officer do? And what can the community at large come together to do to try to mitigate bias and improve relations? And then she brings through these ideas. One of the first ideas that people have thought about and have tried is to reduce time pressure. And she gives this example that I think is pretty cool of how this works. This was a study from a probably psychologist experiment. What they did was they got working priests and they brought them in and they said, okay, we want you to write a sermon on the Good Samaritan, and then you're gonna present the sermon to some people, probably on a campus. So they had them write the sermon, and then when it was time to go and present it, they had 3 conditions. So they either told the priests, you have to walk across campus to this other room, and they either told them, you're early, you're on time, or you're late, and you better hurry. And then they set it up so that while on that walk, the priest encountered somebody who needed some help. And they measured what percentage of the priests stopped to help. And the results are here, which shows that even priests who have been primed to think about the example of the Good Samaritan, if they're in a hurry, only 10% of them will stop to help someone in need. If they're on time, the percentage goes up to sort of mid-40s. But when all time pressure is removed and they're told you're early, you just have plenty of time, get over there, 63% of the priests stop to help, showing that, showing that even for people who've just dedicated their lives to helping others, situations can trump their values sometimes. But one way to counteract that is to make sure that they're not rushed, and giving them that extra time can let them access the values that they do actually believe in and act in the way that they would want to. Another way is to decrease stress and fatigue. And this particularly relates to situations like this. And she kind of outlines some departments that have made some policy changes, particularly in protest situations, to rotate officers more frequently off of lines like this, because it's difficult, it's tiring, it's very stressful duty. And the idea is that by rotating officers more frequently, getting them more breaks, keeping them better rested, again, they'll be better able to access the values that they actually believe in and not react based on their fatigue or their level of stress. Another idea for combating implicit bias is just training in general. And so they bring up this training that we are actually presenting as one example. But they also give this example, and this goes back to the shoot, don't shoot experiment. That obviously was pioneered by somebody given probably to college undergrads first, but that study has been given many times to many different groups of people. And one thing that they saw when they gave this experiment to trained police officers is that police officers had sort of mixed results, but different from sort of the general population. Police officers still showed the same race effect in reaction times, and that their reaction times were slower when they were presented with this essentially conflicting picture that conflicts with the Black crime bias. But when they looked at error rates of police officers, the difference disappeared, and police officers essentially showed no race effect in the errors that they made. And the reason they believe is that police officers do get as a part of their training from very early on in confrontations like that, to focus on people's hands, to look immediately for the hands, to look for guns, and that there are really severe consequences for making a bad decision. That bullet that you fire erroneously, that's $1 million or whatever they tell you. And that training seems to have eliminated the effect in the error rate. And then she goes on to describe and discuss how more training in general, sharpening officers' skills, gives them more confidence, decreases their stress in volatile situations, and can help them to react against or to combat the implicit bias. Another way that she describes is encouraging accountability. She gives this example outside of law enforcement, which was somebody went and studied baseball, and they studied umpires calling balls and strikes, and documented that umpires showed a racial bias. But then in ballparks where umpires knew that there was a camera watching and sort of an automated strike zone, that effect disappeared. The obvious connection to law enforcement is in body-worn cameras. When this training started, they were less widely adopted than they are now. And 5 years on, I think they're very widely adopted in the industry. But she presented this graph. This was data from OPD and as on the bottom shows from 2009, before OPD had cameras, and they introduced about 100 extra cameras a year into their officer population, and show that over that time, as they introduced cameras, use of force incidents went down and complaints went down, with the exception, as is noted, of 2012, which they attribute to some high profile events, some protest events that caused a higher number of complaints. But otherwise, encouraging accountability, putting officers on the record where both people, the officer and the contact, know that the contact is documented, it's on video, tends to, again, let people kind of connect to their values and not react to their stress. Trend line. Another idea that people have tried to mitigate bias is to just highlight that sort of purpose, that noble purpose. That's again one of the objectives of this class. And another way that people have tried to do this is, and I think it was her lab, Spark, actually set this up and created and maintained this website. But it was a website where you could go in, officers could go in and put in their email address, and it just automatically emails you an inspirational quote every day, with the idea being that, you know, it's tough, you come to work, you're worried about the shift, you're kind of stressed, but you get an inspirational quote to just sort of help you, again, reconnect to the values that you came into the profession with, and just give you that little reminder every day of, hey, this is how I want to conduct myself when I'm out and I'm doing my work and I'm on my shift. And then one of the last interventions that she talks about is just to strive for diversity within police departments, and gives the example of some studies that they've done, or at least one study they've done of juries. And when somebody studied juries, they determined that diverse juries, taking into account both racial diversity and gender diversity, the more diverse juries deliberated longer, they made fewer errors in terms of like remembering testimony, remembering facts of the case, and they considered overall more facts than did less diverse juries. And that is the end of Module 5.
And that concludes the Principal Policing Procedural Justice program. So,
Great.
Sorry, I
Thank
know
you.
it's very, very fast, so hopefully
was-
you guys are able to keep up.
yeah, that was at lightning speed and was not ideal by any means. But again, we would have preferred to have presented this in person, with going through again all the materials slowly in groups. And obviously doing like the active kind of facilitated discussion that is kind of what makes this class like so meaningful and impactful. So yeah, we hope we gave you guys and gave you all like a glimpse of kind of what this course is and what we hope our officers get out of it. And often we kind of get the reaction that this was one of the kind of more meaningful courses that they've taken in their careers, which is what we hope that they leave with.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you, Sergeant Rodriguez and Officer McDougall. That's clearly a very comprehensive training. You went through, with the principled policing theme, with procedural process, brought in Franklin Covey's very well-regarded trainings, the history of law enforcement and race oppression. You were very transparent in going through a long history, and some of I understand some of the images were very, some of them are shocking to see, and thanks everybody for the patience of going through that training to understand the purpose of the presentation. Then you have implicit bias, mitigation of bias, and finally diversity and inclusion. How long is this training again? Could you remind me of for your officers?
8 hours. Right?
It's roughly 8 hours.
And are the 5-6 modules, are they split up over a number of days, or is it like a one-day training?
It's a 1-day training. So
Okay.
we like to kind of estimate like one module, like module 1, for example, will typically take us an hour. And then I think modules 4 is about an hour. I think module 5 is generally the longer of the 5. And that usually I think encompasses about 2 hours of the overall curriculum. Because again, we're just kind of really kind of diving into the science of it and ensuring that the participants kind of really take away the science behind it. And then obviously the group exercises kind of take up a large portion of those modules too.
Yeah, I imagine the group exercises in person with that kind of interactive, engaged context is very effective. How often is this training done for your officers?
We were trying to host it at least once a year, but again, trying to squeeze it into like the existing training curriculum and squeeze it in between perishable skills with shooting, defensive tactics, things of that nature. It's rather difficult. And then COVID also made that a little more difficult. But I think we were striving for at least, once over 2 years. Because again, as we mentioned previously, this is a perishable skill. And again, kind of speaks towards the, emotional survival of our officers, right? And its impacts on the community.
Absolutely. And, in particular, the diversity and inclusion training with implicit bias or implicit association or unconscious bias. Those are very important trainings for law enforcement, as well as anyone who has discretionary authority in government in particular. And typically those are required annually. Are there other sections of your principled policing training, in particular that implicit bias aspect, with say the tactical training on shooting that you just described, or use of force? Are they embedded together, or is it kind of a separate module where you're trained in implicit bias in the context of this principled policing class, but then in the tactical training in, for lack of a better term, like use of force or training or shooting, discharge of a weapon? Is there a embedded conversation about implicit associations?
So we don't have like a directly kind of linked policing course with kind of the tactical scenario-based training. And I'm not necessarily a firearms instructor or a tactical instructor, but a lot of, and Alex can speak to this as well, but a lot of that training, a lot of our kind of tactical based training and scenarios have those kind of target discrimination and kind of target assessment portions to them, which kind of really, for us, train us on, again, analyzing and identifying, shoot, no shoot targets. So you're applying the skills that we learned in this training to kind of a realistic, stressful situation.
Yeah, and I encourage that that type of training you did, in particular, that it should be embedded in tactical training. Is something that, like for example, government attorneys are being trained in. For example, I think you mentioned, prosecutors and district attorneys, they go to training in implicit bias, and it's a very common training now in the past number of years. I certainly do that in my context in the federal government, but I encourage you guys to, and I would support your department to do so, to embed these type of practices in the tactical aspect of policing, which I know is very complicated. So I know it's late, it's 10:14, and we really appreciate your being here. We had a hand raised with alternate board member Batista. Oh, she's now lowered it. She's saying no, not anymore. Are there other folks who would like to ask questions or comment? So board member Mizell.
Thank you. Just quick question again. So this is a training for BPD specifically, or a academy side training that folks from BPD go through, and you also do it separately as a department? I just want to be clear on that.
Yeah, if I'm hearing you correctly, this is strictly for BPD. At some point as instructors, we discussed wanting to kind of open it up to include community members, but we never kind of got that far. But it's certainly something that we would like to kind of incorporate at some point in the future.
Okay, thank you. And I would just suggest for the, obviously I don't write these trainings, but for the breakdown police history, it's probably helpful to also put a portion in terms of the police relationship to labor movements, which has been quite fraught, but there's quite a bit of history there as well that may be helpful in giving the full picture. But thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you.
And Board Member Harris also had a question or a comment.
Believe it or not, I did have one question. Just a real quick one. You talked a little bit about the wellness committee that you have there, and just curious to know, how do they support this training throughout the year?
So they kind of help us to put on kind of like the emotional resilience based trainings throughout the year. Because again, knowing that a lot of those kind of emotional skills, we tend to focus on kind of those hard skills, right? The tactics, the firearms, the defensive tactics, but we often overlook the soft skills. So that's kind of where the Wellness and Resilience Committee kind of steps in to kind of fill that gap. And in fact, they recently did a survey, which was, I believe, sponsored by the U.S. Marshals, and they distributed a survey throughout the entire department. I mean, it included both sworn and professional staff. And I think Alex can speak a little bit more, because I think the peer support team was privy to a lot more of kind of the finer details. But it essentially kind of laid out a very kind of disturbing and rather alarming results for us, in that, we kind of at times and in some portions of the study either meet or exceed cops that have these suicidal tendencies. So, and kind of recognizing that and ensuring that we're providing officers with the skills that they need to do their job, and not just be effective police officers, but to also, be emotionally healthy, functioning human beings. So, and then the Wellness and Resilience Committee, they also do, kind of a host of other things. So, and I'm kind of part of that committee as well, when my time allows, but we've also incorporated meditation and brought Headspace meditation app on board and made that available to all of our department members as well. Obviously really big on physical fitness is a big piece of that. And I feel like there's other kind of things that I'm certainly missing, but it's definitely a priority for us.
Okay, thank you. And I just have one other question just about the diversity training part of this. Is there a component that separate from this for diversity training for the staff?
So we periodically have to kind of participate and take diversity training through kind of the post-regulated classes that are administered online. And again, those kind of come, I would say, like once a year or so. But that's obviously separate from this course.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Great course.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? So thank you very much, Sergeant Rodriguez and Officer McDougall, for the comprehensive and very well received training, and I'm glad that you're doing it, and I hope you get support to continue doing so. We certainly support this type of effort and work. So, Director Lee, shall we shift to public comment?
Yes.
All right.
Thank you. It was really
Thank you, guys.
excellent.
All right. Bye-bye.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have
Thank
a
you
good night.
all.
Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. Bye.
I see one raised hand, Chair.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the name of the person.
Mr. Hindler?
Okay, so Miss Hendler,
Hindler,
Hindler.
Cordell Hindler.
I will. You will have 3 minutes. Mr. Hindler, do you hear us? I'm going to share
We
my.
have to allow him to speak.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Could you allow?
There he
and I'll
is.
start the timer. Great, Mr. Hindler. I'm going to start the timer.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So Good evening, Vice Chair Chang, board members. My name is Cordell Henlon. I'm a Richmond resident, so I'll try to stay within the 3-minute period. So, because I know it's getting late into the hour. So, which that proves to my point again, because if you recall, about a month or so ago, I did make some observations on how the meetings have been running in the last month or so, and I find them very refreshing. But my concerns is the length of the presentations, because I'm thinking that I know I've been in similar meetings that have tended to go on a little further. So I'm thinking that as a community member, that I figure that if we can just keep the agenda, like short, and cut the presentations, like in half, that would make things more interesting, because it's a burnout to because the public has to like sit through the rest of the meeting, because I mean they have to go to work in the morning, so they couldn't stay on to hear the rest of the meeting. So I just want to make that observation, and making sure that this does not happen too often. And then, on the good side is you are cordially invited to attend a performance of Home for the Holidays at Contra Costa Civic Theater on December the 3rd through the 5th at 7:30. Tickets are $40 for adults, but if you get the youth rate, it's $20. You just show proof of vaccination and your wear your mask inside. So hopefully everyone will have a good Thanksgiving. I will see you all next month. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Hindler. Director Lee, do we have other speakers?
I see no more raised hands, Chair.
Okay, great, thank you. And just as a comment about the timing issue, of course, it's very important to be efficient in these meetings. We are doing the very important trainings that are required of the Police Accountability Board, and that's part of the reason for the extended amount of time that we've been having at some of these meetings with the trainings. And hopefully, I hope that the members of the public, while it requires a lot of endurance to sit through, that they are also able to gain from participating in the trainings as well. Great. So would someone like to make a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second it.
Great, thank you. That was Board Member Harris, and then I think it was Board Member, was it Leftwich? Okay. So we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Good night,
thank you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.